Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Broccoli Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Becomes Police Consultant. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Midoriya Izuku was quirkless. That much had been obvious since his diagnosis when he was 4. He didn't have any power, and the only difference he had from the other kids at school was that he had an extra toe joint. Midoriya Izuku was quirkless, and ever since he had been identified as such, it had become enough for everyone to know they didn't want to be affiliated with him. It was just how life was for him. The moment people learned that he was powerless, he was alone again. Izuku had long since accepted this as being his reality. But there was more than that to him. No one ever bothered to learn more about him once they knew, so it wasn't a very well-known fact, but Izuku was a person with multiple aspects. He was passionate and had an inexhaustible thirst for knowledge. His mom knew, of course, and she was glad to help satisfy her son's curiosity. He always wanted to learn more, always had more questions, and thought in a way that was unique to him. Midoriya Inko knew, even if nobody else would acknowledge it because of her son's disability, that Izuku was smart. Probably even a genius, if she was honest with herself, but she was sure that if she brought it up to her boy, he would downplay it. Probably a consequence of always being underestimated by everyone around him, she thought to herself sadly. Midoriya Izuku was smart, and his mom hoped that one day someone other than her would see it and give him a chance. Her baby deserved it. Izuku didn't have any friends. That was fine by him, honestly. He had gotten used to it by now. He was used to the solitude and the silence of his apartment on the weekends when his mom worked occasionally. He was alone, but at least no one bothered him for something he couldn't control. It was peaceful, no noise, no bully, no teacher purposefully failing him. He was alone, and however odd it may sound, he was glad about it most of the time. It only meant that there was no one for him to PSS off with his weirdness. It also meant that there was nothing to do, though. His mom wasn't there to talk with him, there was no friend to hang out with, no classes to attempt, and his homework was long since completed. He didn't like it when there was nothing for him to do, the only thing he got out of that was frustration. His mind was itching for a distraction, anything to occupy his thoughts. He needed to find something for his brain to chew on if he didn't want to go bonkers to be in a foul mood when his mom came back from her job. He needed something to analyze before he grew too reckless, he decided. That's what pushed him to turn on the television, promptly switching to the news channel. In their modern heroic society, there always was a fight being broadcasted in between each silly interview with either politicians, celebrities, or limelight heroes. Izuku used to watch those when he was younger, but as his interest in analysis further developed, he began to give more attention to the various quirk-related incidents that were reported to the news channel, rather than the gossiping that was somehow so popular. Information was information, but what was shared in those interviews was rarely worth the time. He waited restlessly for the commercial break to end, using the few minutes of interruption to get out his notebook and a few pens, carefully placing them side by side on the coffee table, all perfectly parallel to the others. He sat on the ground, on one of the couch's cushions, and distractedly played with a strand of his curls. The news shouldn't take long before starting again. And that's the moment where, as if his thoughts somehow gave the signal, the jingle of a special report resonated through the small living room. His eyes snapping on the screen, Izuku started to bounce impatiently. What was it this time? A large-scale villain attack? A natural disaster, perhaps? He wondered which heroes would be featured today. Good afternoon, I'm Kawamoto Noriko and you're watching JNN Japan National News. We're cutting short this interview with some breaking news. Earlier today, local heroes were hurried to the National Japanese Bank of Mizudafu for a bank robbery after one of the witnesses finally managed to contact the authorities. Unfortunately, the culprit had already left the scene before the arrival of the heroes. The police department is currently doing their best to identify the villain with the little viable footage of the security cameras of the bank had to offer and the testimonies of the witnesses. She was still talking, Izuku was aware of that. Probably sharing some meaningless information on the crime, maybe a few interviews with the witnesses or something of that resort. He couldn't care less though. Not while they were broadcasting the briefly mentioned security footage. Izuku grabbed his pen faster than should be possible and started writing down what he deducted from the bad quality film in his notebook. The man has no traits of a mutation quirk, so probably an emitter, since the chances of him being quirkless are, while not impossible, very slim. Though, his face is hidden by a hood, so perhaps a mutation could be masked behind it. The hood may also hint toward at least a bit of thinking before he acted on his plan. Maybe he had thought of the cameras, and since he didn't have a way of getting rid of the footage once he finished was done, he decided to hide his features to render them useless. Or maybe I'm giving him too much credit. He may have just done that because he had seen it in a movie and decided to imitate it. So far he hasn't shown signs of any kind of quirk. He might not be using it because he knows that it would allow the authorities to identify him. Or it could be useless in this situation. He successfully scared the witnesses into silence and collected the money. Nothing exploitable so far. He might be more organized than what I thought then. He's got what he had came for and now he's leaving. Wait, the doors are locked? The cashier must have set off the alarm. It might not have been the brightest idea though. It could anger the... Wait, no, he just broke the door. Maybe a strength quirk then. It seemed easy enough to him. But something doesn't add up. His brows furrowed, and Izuku took a moment to put his thoughts in order. He was missing something here, but what? Reaching for the remote, he went back to the beginning of the footage. Maybe reviewing it would help him figure it out. Squinting, he watched carefully as the blurry pictures replayed a second time on the screen. Widened once he saw it. It was a tiny detail, but it was enough to help him figure it out. It's not a strength quirk. He had way too much of a hard time lifting his bag once it was full of money, so it must something else about his quirk that allowed him to break down that door. It really does look like he teared it off its hinges though. Perhaps a weakening quirk then. By weakening the material of the door, he would have been able to tear it off really easily, but it wouldn't have helped him lift the bag anyway, since weakening its material wouldn't have made it any more easy. All it would have really done would have been breaking the handle, which is more than counterproductive. It would also confirm my emitter quirk theory. It's a really good strategy since it will throw off the police. If they thought he has a strength quirk, which I'm brought to think is what the villain was aiming for after witnessing that display, they wouldn't think of searching for a weakening quirk. They wouldn't have the good lead, and by the time they realized their mistake, he would have had the time to get away and it would be too late. Judging by the difficulties he seemed to have with the weight of the bag, I would also tend to think that he suffers from back pain of some sort. While all those bills must be pretty heavy, I doubt it would have pained him that much if it wasn't of an exterior other factor. Izuku snapped out of it when something the reporter said somehow got through his hyper-focused mind. If you have any information on this villain's identity, please report to your local police department. Thank you, Kawamoto. It's Dash. They were changing the subject. That was Izuku's hint to power the television back off, which he promptly did. He could have kept watching whatever segment they had continued with, but Kawamoto's words stuck in his mind. He needed to think about it, and he wouldn't be able to do so with the television on in the background. If you have any information on this villain's identity, please report to your local police department. For some reason, that sentence kept repeating itself in the back of his mind. It's not like he had any concrete information to give them. What he knew was merely theories. He observed the footage and drew conclusions from what he observed. If he was able to think up those at 13 years old, an experienced police officer could probably do the same. They wouldn't think of searching for a weakening quirk. Actually, when you think about it, the villain really did put on quite a good show. Maybe the police really didn't catch on. Please report to your local police department. Izuku might just do that actually. It was always worth a shot. And it's not like he had anything to lose by doing so. His afternoon just so happened to be free too. Izuku sat across from a man, Detective Tsukachi Naomasa, he had said he was called, in an interrogation room. There was a metallic table in between them on which rested a closed file. Probably the one about the bank robbery. It wasn't that wild of a guess since that is exactly what he had said he came in for. The officer at the front desk had been quite skeptical when he first came in. He didn't blame them, of course. After all, he was a middle schooler. It was only logical for them to doubt the claims of a literal child. especially when said child announced he had important information on a villain he claimed he had never even met. But they still gave him a chance, giving Izuku the feeling that they truly had nothing to work with. And so that is how Izuku ended up in the interrogation room with Detective Tsukachi, to whom he handed his notebook, opened on his latest entry, the analysis he made of the security footage of that day's robbery. Tsukachi was frowning as he read the handwritten analysis the kid had given him for what must have to be the third or fifth time. Izuku sincerely hoped that the detective would take his theory seriously, even if it didn't go any farther than that. He was trying to help, he did his part of the deal. Whether they chose to believe him or not was their move. And the more he thought about it, the more it seemed likely that the villain had purposefully made his quirk appear like a strength enhancer to outwit the police. He would hate for the criminal to get away when he had the information needed to catch him. The detective went back a couple of pages at some point. Izuku tensed up when Tsukachi did so. He usually didn't give his notebook to anyone willingly, especially a stranger, due to the reactions people usually get from his analysis. Everyone thinks that it's creepy, and on more than one occasion people tried to destroy it, namely Bakugo. For some reason, the blonde had the uncanny habit of trying his hardest to destroy his hard work. Izuku sewed a fake bottom in his school bag specifically to hide his notebooks from him. Too many times had he lost hours of work at the hands of others. And now he was once again rendered powerless as he watched the police officer browse through the filled pages of the book. Thankfully, though, Tsukachi seemed to eventually catch on to his discomfort. He closed the notebook unceremoniously and slid it across the table toward Izuku, who immediately placed his hand on it as if to reassure himself that it had remained intact and undestroyed. So, you understood all that from the short bit of security footage the media got access to? The man asked. Yes, sir. All right then, he sighed. We'll look into it. It's not like we've got any better lead at the moment. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. The detective stood and beelined for the door of the interrogation room, but stopped before he exited. Oh, and keep an eye on those analyses of yours, will you? We would want them to get in the wrong hands. Have a good day, Midoriya. And then only did he leave, leaving an astonished Izuku to blink owlishly at the spot the man once stood in. What was it that he said about his analysis? We wouldn't want them to end up in the wrong hands? What would anyone even do with it? What use could the theories of a 13-year-old have in the wrong hands? It couldn't be that good, could it? Eventually, he just shrugged it off and nervously made his way out of the precinct. It probably meant nothing. Or the detective somehow understood that his work was prone to destruction and advised him to keep it safe. It must be that. Izuku refused to think of the possibility of his notes being a danger to the safety of heroes. His notebook, however, burned. His palm as he made his way back home, reminding him that no matter what he wished for, he did just guess a man's quirk with seconds of bad quality footage, despite said man's best effort to make him, and everyone else, believe it was something else. That reminder was an unpleasant one. To his confusion, Izuku was back in the precinct. He didn't understand why, though. Perhaps it had something to do with the bank robbery from a few days ago. It was, after all, the only instance he had come in contact with the police. The villain had been arrested too, he had seen it on the news. His theory had been right apparently, and the police, with the help of a few heroes, apprehended Sano Yoshiro, 36 years old, in his own home, a few days ago. He seemed to have been a bit too sure of his plan, or at least enough to remain in his registered residence, which ultimately led to his arrest. His loot had been returned to the bank shortly after. So, really, Izuku had no clue as to why he had been called back to the precinct and hoped to learn about the reason for his presence sooner than later. Detective Tsukachi was waiting in the lobby when he first arrived, chatting with the officer at the front desk, which was a different one than from his last visit. He stood to the side, not wanting to interrupt their conversation, but the man quickly noticed him and waved at him to approach. Reluctantly, Izuku made his way toward the two adults. Midoriya, glad to see you could make it, Tsukachi greeted him. He waved goodbye to his colleague before making his way deeper into the precinct, guiding the teenager toward a conference room. Midoriya hummed in reply, unsure of the way to act. He awkwardly followed the detective through the halls, avoiding the curious glances of the other police officers. He sat at the table of the conference table when he was invited to and warily watched the detective lock the door behind them. This second visit to the precinct made him nervous. The first time, he had come on his own accord and had known what to expect. Not this time. This time, it was the detective who had called him directly and asked if they could talk, without precision what the reason for their unexpected meeting was. So now, Izuku was locked in a room with a man he had talked to one time and had no idea why he was there. In his opinion, he was rightfully nervous. He fidgeted as he watched Tsukachi make his way around the large table to sit across from him. He took out a sheet of paper and placed it face down beside him before placing his hands back on the table in front of him to look at Izuku, his head tilted to the side ever so slightly. They stayed there for a moment, staring at each other in silence. It was only when he started to squirm in his chair that the detective began talking. "I guess you're wondering why I called you back here." "Well, why yeah. Don't worry, Midoriya, you're not in trouble." Then WIMIH here? "First of all, I wanted to thank you. Your notes were a precious help in the resolution of this case. We might have found his trail far too late if it weren't for what you picked up from the news." "Thank you. It's nothing, it's just a hobby of mine. I just happened to have noticed something you didn't at first." "Far from it, actually. Your analysis is pretty impressive. You managed to break down a quirk with far less material than what we had on hand, and with far better results. We managed to catch that villain thanks to you, Midoriya. It's a real talent you've got there. Which brings us to the second reason I called you back here. I have an offer for you." "What is it?" Izuku asked curiously, though a cautious edge remained in his voice. "To begin with, I've already checked in with my superiors to not get your hopes up for no reason, were you to be interested, and got the confirmation that it was possible this very morning. All we would need to officialize our deal is your, and your guardian's, agreement. All of this to say, would you like to join the police force as a consultant?" A beat of silence. "Wait, what? You've really impressed me with that notebook of yours, Midoriya. And to be truthful with you here, not only was I impressed, but so were my superiors. They're not willing to allow just anybody to become a consultant, you know." But I'm quirkless." "I know. And that doesn't take away an ounce of your talent. So what will it be?" Izuku took a moment to think about it, before saying screw it to all of his hesitations. "I accept. I'll just have to ask my mom for her permission later." "Glad to hear it, Consultant Midoriya." Tsukachi smiled at him. Shyly, Izuku smiled back. There was his chance to help, and he wasn't going to let it go this easily, he decided, determined. When Izuku entered the precinct yet another time a few days later, he was febrile. What else would you have expected from him? He, who had been told countless times that he wouldn't do anything good in his life, had been recruited by an actual detective. A real one, who thought that Izuku was skilled. Everyone had always said that his analysis was creepy, but Detective Tsukachi said that they were good. Even that it was an asset in this field. Honestly, Izuku had been certain that it had all been a very vivid and elaborate dream when he woke up the morning after he received the offer. No one had ever been this kind to him before, especially after he told them that he was quirkless. So it had to all be nothing more than a product of his fertile imagination. But when he turned on the television, the news of Sano Yoshiro's arrest flashed before his eyes, a glaring reminder that it had, indeed, really happened. That he had really helped to catch a real criminal with his analysis. That he had helped. If he had broken down in tears when he learned that he had really saved the day, that he had truly helped, like he had dreamed to do for all those years, well, it was between his mother and him. He had half expected the detective to call him back and say that he was going back on his words during the following days, once the man realized that he had offered to a quirkless kid to become a consultant. It wouldn't even have surprised him. It would have hurt, sure, as it always did when he got his hopes up to be deceived just as quickly, but it was his life. He was, as sad as it was to admit, used to it. But the dreaded call never came, much to both his confusion and relief. So Izuku presented himself at the precinct the day Tsukachi had offered, to which he had immediately agreed. It was the only day the detective had a clear enough schedule to introduce him to the rest of the staff, he had explained. He had sounded apologetic for imposing a date on him like that, though Izuku really didn't see any issue with it. It's not like he had a really busy agenda anyway. And he could allow himself a few days off of school, he thought. It's not like he would miss anything important, especially with how easy the curriculum was for him. His teachers didn't care if he came or not either way. Nervously, he beelined for the front desk. The officer that sat behind it didn't notice him at first, so, shyly, Izuku cleared his throat to get their attention. Excuse me, I'm looking for Detective Tsukachi, do you dash? Midoriya. Izuku jumped out of his skin when he heard his name being called out and promptly turned around to see the man he had just been looking for. Tsukachi rushed into the hall, looking slightly out of breath, but smiled at him, nonetheless. I'm glad you could come today. Follow me, you can drop your stuff in my office, I'll make you visit after. He didn't need to be told 2 times. He waved at the officer behind the desk before scurrying over to Tsukachi, who waved at him to follow him in the department of the precinct. The walk to the detective's office was a short one, but it felt like an eternity to Izuku. The gazes that followed him all the way made it seem so much longer, as if every new pair of eyes that found him somehow slowed time. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, at least, not in a non-threatening way. Well, he tried not to think of it as threatening. He was fairly sure that it wasn't hostile, yet he found himself to be longing the way he was usually ignored by his peers. It wasn't better in any way since it meant that he didn't have any friends, but at least it was way less nerve-wracking. Tsukachi closed the door behind them. You can put your things over there, he said, gesturing toward an uncomfortable-looking armchair. I'll just go fetch your ID and I'll be back in a moment, all right? And with a last reassuring smile thrown in his direction, Tsukachi left him alone in his office. At least he kind of promised to come back. Izuku stared at the door for a few seconds, processing the fact that the detective really did just leave like that. He eventually snapped out of it and went to drop his backpack by the chair. Tsukachi would be back. Hopefully. But for now, he was alone in the detective's office, a place that he knew nothing of. There shouldn't be any problem if he just looked around, right? He wouldn't even touch anything. It's not like he had anything better than that to do anyway. And just maybe it would also allow him to get to know his new coworker. He had coworkers. Now, not just classmates, actual colleagues he got to work with to help people in need, a little bit better. He looked around the room from his spot by the couch. Tsukachi's office was a really bare place, which was surprisingly unsurprising. He seemed like the kind of person who didn't mix his job with his personal life. There were a few cabinets against the far back wall, a large desk in the middle of the room, and obviously, a few seats, to be exact. The armchair, one behind the desk for the detective and 2 facing it, for potential guests or what's not. There were also some boring abstract paintings to fill the walls and a few unexpected plants. He wouldn't have thought that Tsukachi had a green thumb. On the desk, there was a closed laptop, a pile of files, a cup full of pens and pencils, there was a cat printed on it, and a few frames. Turns out Tsukachi was actually the type to mix personal and professional life, just on a small scale. Curious, Izuku made his way around the desk to get a better view of the pictures. Most of them showed a woman, probably in her early 20s, who looked an awful lot like the detective. She must be his sister. She was alone in one, then posing with her brother in another, and there was also one frame in which she was with a group he recognized as being the Naruhata Vigilantes, as well as the American hero, Captain Celebrity. He frowned when he recognized the foreign hero. He hadn't been in Japan for long, but enough had happened around him during that short amount of time for his entourage to become quite well known. Seeing him standing next to Tsukachi's sister, along with the Vigilantes, was enough to light a spark of recognition in him. Where had he seen her before? The door opened before he could get his answer. Scurrying back in front of the desk, Izuku came to a stop just in time to see the detective come back in, followed by another man, probably a higher-up, who had what he assumed to be a dog mutation quirk. It must be so useful in the police force if his senses were as strong as those of an actual dog. Midoriya, here is your ID. Sorry for taking that long. I met Tsuragami, the chief of the police in this prefecture, on my way, and when I told them that you were in today, he wanted to meet you, Tsukachi said as he handed him a piece of plastic on which figured his school photo, his name, his pronouns, and his title, consultant, was printed on it in bold characters. It was attached to a dark blue lanyard printed with the logo of the police force on all its length. Thank you, Tsukachi-san. It's a nice to meet you, Tsuragin-san, he exclaimed, smiling nervously. Nice to meet you as well, Midoriya. Tsukachi talks highly of you. I heard that it's thanks to you that we were able to catch that bank robber. It's nothing much, sir. Only a bunch of observations I made from the footage that was diffused on the N News. Tsukachi laughed at that. Feeling his ears turning red, Izuku glanced anxiously at the detective, only to see that he was looking at him incredulously. Don't downplay your skills, kid. It was a really impressive analysis. He even has a full notebook of those. He directed that last sentence to Tsuragami. Really now? Could I have a look at it eventually? He asked, visibly interested. That wasn't something Izuku knew how to deal with. People typically did not react that way, with genuine curiosity, like they thought the book was worth something, at the mention of his notebook. He had seen them weirded out, scared, disgusted. Usually, his notes were a subject of mockery, not interest. He wasn't used to any kind of positive reaction, didn't get any actually, not until he met the detective, and he certainly did not know how to react. There were too many unknowns to his comfort. But he still hesitantly answered, his voice barely more than a whisper. I have one in my backpack right now if you want. Would you be comfortable with lending it to me for the day? I would give it back to you before your departure tonight. It was obvious that the two officers had picked up on his hesitance. It was weird. Usually, people weren't able to read him that easily. Or maybe they just didn't care enough to do anything about his discomfort. Sure. He shuffled toward his backpack and took out the battered notebook that was labeled with a smudged 13. For some reason, this particular edition of his hero analysis had been through a lot more than any of those that had come before. It was still usable and readable though, so he didn't see a reason to get rid of it. He handed it to Tsuragami, who took it carefully. Thank you, Midoriya. I'll make sure that this is returned to you. Have a good first day. The dog-headed man nodded at them before leaving the office, bringing the damaged notebook with him. Izuku stared at the spot Tsuragami had been a moment before, frozen as he walked back through that conversation in his mind. That was the chief of the police. That just talked to him like he was someone important. And he gave him his notebook. The chief of the police was going to read his notebook. He stayed like that until Tsukachi snapped him out of his stupor, quite literally since Izuku came back to himself to fingers being snapped in front of his face. So, are you ready for a tour of the precinct? He asked with an easy smile. Izuku wordlessly nodded and followed behind the detective as they left the office, passing the lanyard around his neck as they walked. He understood why they were doing a tour, really. He was going to work here, so it would be better if he knew how to get around the building. That doesn't mean he had to like it, though. He was a kid sporting a consultant ID and receiving a tour. It was a given that it would catch everyone's attention. Which, as previously mentioned, wasn't something he was very fond of. But it was just for the time of the tour, right? He could deal with it for that long. They began smoothly with the bullpen, which they didn't stay in for long. There wasn't much to see in there anyway. Going down a hallway, Izuku saw the locker room and the gym the police officers had access to. He was told where the shooting range was, but they didn't go down there. Instead, they went back, and he was shown where the higher-ups' offices were. He was introduced to some of them, but most were busy, so they merely greeted him before leaving. After seeing the evidence and interrogation rooms, they went back to the bullpen, where Izuku left for a moment to buy himself a snack from one of the vending machines. It was during that time that Tsukachi, who was leaning on one of the desks as he waited for the teen to come back, was approached by one of his colleagues. Tsukachi, a cat hybrid, called him out. Sansa, how has been your day so far? Nothing major happened? He smiled at the man. No, nothing too overbearing. It's a surprisingly calm day. You were making that new intern of yours visit today, right? How are they? It's a new consultant, actually. And he's great. Actually, he's the one over there, he said, motioning toward where Izuku still was in front of vending machines. That's the kid. He's what, like 12? 13, actually. Are you sure of your shot here? He's pretty young, you're sure he's cut for the job. You're saying that because you don't know what he can do, Sansa. You didn't see him. I see him just fine, thank you. See him at work, I mean, dumbass. Maybe, he sighed, But he's just a kid. And a pretty smart one at that. Tsukachi agreed non-committally. Izuku came back at that moment, walking back toward where he had left the detective, an energy drink in hand. Seeing the kid coming their way, Sansa nodded at his colleague before leaving, probably to go back to his desk or to whatever he had to do elsewhere in the building. Was there something else we needed to see, Tsukachi-san? There were the conference rooms, and after that we'll go back to my office. There's something I wanted to show you. Izuku nodded in agreement, and off they were again, the detective guiding the team toward their last stop. Thankfully, the conference rooms weren't on the other side of the precinct. His office, however, was, and he dreaded the long walk back to the comfortable chair waiting for him behind his desk. The thing that hadn't been planned, though, was that one of the rooms, the one that had windows opening on the hall, was busy. And seemingly, whatever it was the officers in there were working on was giving them a headache. Curious, the kid got closer to the glass and observed the scene inside. Half a dozen of officers were slouched in the seats surrounding the large table that occupied most of the space. Many manila folders were thrown open on the surface and were being glared at by more than one as if their contents somehow offended them. And finally, on a board on the opposite side of the room, was displayed a large projection of what Izuku assumed to be a villain on a hero fight, most likely Endeavor judging by the large scorching marks. In a much smaller format were two pictures that he hadn't noticed at first. They were criminals, or at least one of them was if the literal mugshot was anything to go by. The second image, being all blurry and of very poor quality, must have been from a security camera. And right below their faces were scribbled the words, "Missing? Dead?" in red marker. That caught Izuku's attention. And when his attention was caught, it wasn't just half of it. Because criminals don't just vanish now, do they? Even if the flame hero had accidentally cremated them, the cleanup team would have found some kind of remains. "Could I go in to see?" he asked without thinking. When he realized what he had just done, he felt heat creep up the back of his neck and was about to take it back when Tsukachi answered. "Sure," he shrugged. "I'm sure a new pair of eyes could help them." And with that, the detective opened the door to the conference room, bringing everyone's attention to them. That was it, Izuku was going to die today. They stared at him curiously for a moment, but then their gazes quickly shifted to Tsukachi. And immediately, relief appeared on their features. "Detective Tsukachi! Thank goodness, we were starting to lose hope we would ever solve that case. We've been stagnating for so long," one of them exclaimed. "Read, find." "I can see that," he began, "but I won't be the one helping you out today. I present to you Midoriya Izuku, our latest hire. He wanted to have a look, and I'm sure he'll be able to give you a hand." Betrayed, Izuku glared half-heartedly at Tsukachi, who ignored him. He noticed the small smirk, though he wasn't blind. There was a moment of silence as all of the adults in the room took in the fact that the detective wasn't there to help them, to their disappointment. Only then did they recall that he had just promised them the help of the new consultant, which brought them back the hope to close the case one day. Eagerly, they glanced at the newcomer again. "But they're just a kid," one of them finally stated, dumbly, after a moment of silence, dumbfounded. "I'm aware of that." Tsukachi rolled his eyes. "Now, would any of you be willing to brief him on the case so that we could get done with it?" It took a few seconds, but eventually, one of them cleared their throat before motioning at the board in front of them. Endeavor was sent to deal with a bank robbery today, but the villains were simply nowhere to be found once the flames died. They vanished, and it's becoming a pain in the butt. "Shut up, Minoru, don't swear in front of the kid. All we've got is the identity of one of them," another interrupted the escalating argument, bringing the focus back to the matter at hand. A shitty picture of the other and the scene of the fight, no matter how little use it proved to have so far. Now we're trying to figure out if Endeavor somehow managed to cremate them or if they got away, Izuku interrupted. What? They escaped. One must have had an ice quirk of some kind, which protected them from the flames and allowed them to get away, he explained, suddenly focused on the puzzle offered to him. "And how would you know that?" another one asked, sitting straighter in their chair. Izuku walked up to the enlarged picture of today's scene crime, because that's what it was, but the commission was too much of a bunch of cowards to say it out loud, and motioned at the odd puddle that somehow existed in the middle of all of those burn marks. That's where they must have been when the villain with the ice quirk used it to protect them. Then, they took advantage of the chaos to run away in the crowd that had no doubt gathered to watch the fight. Do we know if they might have brought anything with them? Was their robbery successful? It was. They robbed a few banks and jewelry stores and harmed some civilians in the process. Why? How much? How much what? For how much have they stolen? $1 billion or $2 billion. It's hard to estimate on such short notice, and some of it must have been destroyed in the fight. So, they might have wanted to leave the country. Why? The Japanese authorities know about the stolen goods, but not foreign countries. And how would they have done that? Someone inquired. If they were smart enough to use ice for cover. Give me a second. Pulling out his phone, Izuku turned his back on the officers and opened a Google tab. He started muttering as he searched through the internet and verified his theories. The officers watched him curiously while he did his thing. He was pacing and none of them could understand a single word he uttered as he rambled, but if he was right, he would have made more progress in a few minutes than what they had done all day. Which, if they were being honest, while they were slightly offended that some kid could just walk in and solve a case none of them had figured out in a fraction of the time they had previously spent on it, was also quite impressive. Suddenly, the kid put his phone back in his pocket and flashed them a triumphant smile. They all blinked, momentarily blinded. Gone was the shyness from earlier, Tsukachi noted. It was as if the kid had become a completely different person the moment he got to work. He looked a lot more confident than he had throughout their tour. Because it was his domain, the man realized, and the kid knew what he was doing. They should land at Akita Airport in about 2 hours, he announced. If you get someone there fast enough, you might catch them before they leave the country. And how are you so sure? Someone asked, skeptical. I'm not, he shrugged, but that's what I would have done. Otherwise, I can also give you an estimated perimeter of research if you don't already have one. Because I can guarantee you that Endeavor didn't kill them today. Later, as Tsukachi was showing the thing he had wanted to show Izuku in his office, it was the police's database, which while fascinating, was a lot less exciting than a pair of thieves on the run. The door slammed open. One of the officers from the conference stared at Izuku like it was the first time he was seeing him. He squirmed in his seat under the gaze. What is it? Tsukachi asked patiently. They caught them. They landed at Akita Airport just like he said. The heroes only had to collect them as they got off the plane. If anyone tells you that it's easy to gain respect as a 13-year-old quirkless consultant, they're oh so obviously lying. Because, as it turned out, trying to get respected by actual police officers as a 13-year-old quirkless consultant is incredibly difficult. Near impossible even. And you can believe Izuku on that, since he has been through it all. To this day, he's still shocked he actually somehow succeeded at that. Because people are quirkist, even police officers, and they tend to underestimate those who they think are inferior to them, such as quirkless people, middle schoolers or quirkless middle schoolers. He was lucky to have Tsukachi in his corner to push him to speak up. He was quick to notice that the other officers were hesitant to go against the detective's words, which gave him just the time he needed to prove them of his credibility himself. So Izuku spent the last few months doing just that, putting his nose in so many cases that he lost count at some point. It annoyed everyone at first, which, fair. He was a kid and it must be somewhat embarrassing for actual police officers to be corrected by someone half, even as much as a third or a fourth sometimes, their age. He didn't blame them. But thanks goodness, their downright hostile and disdainful behavior quickly shifted to become more of a sympathetic teasing. They even went as far as to directly ask him for his input sometimes. It took a while to be really accepted as being part of the team, but it was worth it. Now he got to help. He wasn't a hero like he had always dreamed to be, not yet anyway, but by doing what he did, he made sure that no innocent were condemned for a crime that they didn't commit and that the bad guys were brought to justice. He was helping and that's all that mattered. So that Saturday, Izuku happily clocked in before going up the staircase and toward the conference room that had basically become his office since he got hired. He wasn't often alone in it since teamwork was a really important value in the precinct, but that's the place everyone knew they could find him if there was something they needed to ask him. It was also where they could leave the files of ongoing cases for him to take a look at, which was precisely what he had in mind when he left his home that morning. He pushed the door open to see that the room was already occupied by two of his colleagues, the officers Sakai Osamu and Honda Minoru, who were among the youngest in the precinct. They merely nodded at him in greeting before going back to whatever it was they were working on. Izuku too didn't do more than a quick wave before dropping his back by his usual chair and grabbing the file he had been working through the day before. Dropping in the seat, he opened the manila folder and started to work. Izuku really liked working in the precinct with the rest of his colleagues. It was a whole lot easier and much more pleasant than trying to get something done at school. Here, they left him work in peace, respecting his boundaries. They knew better than to disturb him while he was working his way through some case. His classmates, on the other hand, would rarely give him more than a few minutes of grace before starting to throw stuff at him, or whatever they decided would be more entertaining than the teacher's explanations. He learned to work around it, but he still preferred working in a more peaceful and organized space. His opinions were valued, as he often brought a different perspective to a difficult case. The case of the fugitives wasn't the last one on which he opened their eyes to something they would have never considered. Obviously, it was more often that not quirk-related information that helped. Most of his colleagues, just like about anyone who had a quirk if he was being honest, didn't know much about those powers outside of their own, so to them he was a breath of fresh air. Self-centered JRKS. That, and he really enjoyed solving those cases. They were, as much as Tsuragami-san disliked the comparison, like puzzles to him. Exactly like quirks. Izuku liked to do puzzles, to understand and solve them. And he was good at it. He breezed through them, piecing everything together like it was the easiest thing on earth. So, predictably, finishing what he had began the night before didn't take him long. He placed the now annotated file on the completed pile, a quickly growing tower of folders that would be distributed to the right people later that day, and randomly chose a new one among those on the table. The shuffling caught the attention of the two younger officers, who briefly raised their heads to look at the kid as he opened yet another folder. They ever so slightly shook their heads and went back to work just as quickly. It wasn't the first time they saw Izuku switch cases a lot quicker than he should. The teen was a genius though, or so he was rumored to be, so they stopped questioning it after a while. Something about this time, however, caught Minoru's attention. Frowning, he looked back up about it. Isn't there an awful lot of confidential stamps on this manila folder? His eyes widened when he finally connected the dots. Brutally, he stood up, sending his chair backward loudly, which jolted Osamu out of their focused state, and leaned across the table to try and get his hands on the DMED file before Izuku read too much. The kid was, however, much quicker than he was. The teen promptly pushed on the table with his feet and rolled out of reach before Minoru could stop him, never once taking his eyes off the page. Midoriya, wait, you shouldn't be reading that, he tried to warn him. Don't worry, Honda-san, I've seen true crimes documentary much more gruesome than that. That's when Osamu saw what all of the commotion was about. Recognizing the multiple stamps covering the folder, they immediately knew that this shouldn't be in the hands of someone that young. Sure, Izuku had worked on a ton of other cases, but there was a limit to the horrors a child should be allowed to see. Midoriya, that's the hero killer file. They tried carefully. My point exactly. Minoru and Osamu shared a look, not knowing what to do. They could try to go and take it out of the teen's hands, but they both knew it would be pointless. Izuku was nimble, and they really didn't want to clean up the mess that would result in chasing the him around the conference room. Once was enough. So instead, they powerlessly watched Izuku skim through the thick document. They hadn't had the time to go through the file themselves, but they had a pretty good idea of what was in there. If it was anything like their usual murder cases, there must be multiple pictures of the victims and scenes. And the hero killer wasn't exactly known for being family-friendly. His kills were gruesome, and the fact that Izuku, who was a mere child in every way that counted, was currently going through that didn't sit well with either of them. They nervously watched as he turned the pages, his frown growing a bit more with each picture and each report he read. Why the F is there so little on Stain's methods in there? There's nothing useful to find the guy. He's a serial killer for a reason, kid, Minoru said cautiously. He never left much traces behind him, otherwise he would already be behind the bars. You're all blind, he deadpanned, every single one of you. And why is that? Osamu asked, slightly offended. Paralysis. Paralysis? What does that has to do with anything? Everything. Care to walk us through your thoughts, genius boy? Izuku rolled his way back to the table and dropped the file on the table. To see what the younger had to explain, Minoru and Osama pushed away everything that packed the table, not caring about the few files that very clearly fell down if what they heard was anything to go by, and sat on it, leaning toward him. So, every single victim has the same kind of injuries. Yeah, we already figured he uses some kind of blades, probably katanas among others. Yeah, but it's not the only thing it's useful to know for. The victims all show the same rushed slashes, at least one if not more. It's irregular and not very deep, just enough to draw blood without being lethal. And then they have this one last wound, that one precise and lethal. The difference between the two types of wound is so obvious, I can't believe no one noticed them before. But what does it mean? It means that they didn't struggle when they received the last blow. Or they couldn't. Thus the paralysis. Minoru understood, But how? Questioned Osamu. There was nothing from the autopsies that could have hinted toward that conclusion. None of them had anything in their system. It's the only option though. There isn't any restraint mark. And if it was a new or uncommon substance, it wouldn't have been recognized by the usual tests. Or if it had been a quirk-induced, it couldn't have been recognized either. But it couldn't be electricity-induced because there wasn't any burns on the victim. He slowly devolved in mumbles without however becoming impossible to understand, nor could they have simply been unconscious since barely any of them suffered of a head trauma blunt enough for them to pass out. What's most likely is that he either stabbed them with a blade coated in some kind of unknown paralyzing substance or it's quirk-induced. So, if I understood that correctly, the hero killer is somehow paralyzing his victims. Exactly. They stayed silent for a moment, all three of them staring at the sprayed-out file on the table before them. Did you just figure out the hero killer? Yeah. Oh my gods, he just figured out the hero killer. What do we do now? Stumbling, Osamu got off the table and walked out, much to their two colleagues' confusion. Wringing their hands together, they made their way down the hall and stopped in front of a door, on which they knocked before promptly entering. The man behind the desk raised his head in surprise, but quickly his expression shifted into a warm smile. Sakai, Tsukachi greeted him, what can I help you with? Midoriya figured out the hero killer, they blurted out. No need to attempt small talk with a new like that. There was a beat of silence, and he did what? Unlike most of his peers, who were praised for their quirks the moment they came in, Shinso Hitoshi understood quickly that his brought nothing good. Of course, at first, he didn't understand what was wrong with it, but he still adjusted to his new reality. At some point, it's all one could do after being repeated over and over again that their quirk made them a villain. He didn't use his brainwashing and, after one too many, there were 4 times really, but it was enough for others to despise him, instances where he accidentally activated his quirk, he stopped asking direct questions altogether. He tried his best to befriend others for a long time, changing things they didn't like to make himself more likable. Still, other kids kept their distances. They said he was villainous. But adults said so too, so they must be right, no? It took a while for his current foster parents to get it through his thick skull that it wasn't okay for them to tell such a thing to a young child. But after a while, Hitoshi gave up. No matter how hard he tried, no matter the efforts he put into it, no one wanted him, so why should he keep trying? He stayed away from his peers, did his things on his own and didn't ask for help. Why ask someone who didn't want to hear him talk to help when there was the internet, after all? His life was sad and lonely, but it had been that way for so long that he didn't even care that much anymore. That didn't mean that he wasn't still bitter when he saw his classmates hang out with their friends, jealous of something that hadn't been his for so long, but he stayed quiet about it. It simply was how things were, and he wasn't about to get a chance at that anytime soon. At first, that day hadn't been particularly different than any others. He didn't talk to anyone at school, his peers were being mean and he ate lunch alone. The usual for him. His day had been a completely normal one until he ended up at the police station, quirk suppressing cuffs on his wrists, instead of going back to his foster home. At that moment, his day had gone from normal to absolute hell. He knew that everyone in his school thought of him as a villain and had been trying to expose the truth to the world for a while now. Their attempts were futile since he hadn't done anything wrong, thought it did scare most people away, but they kept trying despite the barely existent results. They kept trying to show how much of a bad person he was, so far limiting themselves to exposing his quirk to anyone who might want to befriend him and telling inoffensive stories about his multiple crimes. It was annoying but not that bad. And then they did worst. So much worst. At this point, it was almost laughable how hard they tried to make him seem like the villain when they were the ones to cause harm. But as usual, they did something bad and then pinned it on Hitoshi, because he was the villain. And no one ever believed the villain, did they? But this time they went too far, because how else would one explain that someone was at the hospital and he was at the police station? Fiddling with the chain of his cuffs, Hitoshi shamelessly glared at the officer that sat on the opposite side of the desk, who returned the favor to the purple-haired teen. He had been there for about an hour now and he already hated the man. So let's recapitulate, the policeman, Officer Goto Madoka, said. The bell rung, you left class with your classmates, and as you waited to cross the road with a few others, you brainwashed Kanda Katsuro and made him push Mikami Eiji into the traffic dash. But I didn't brainwash Kanda though. Don't interrupt me, young man. As I was saying, you forced one of your classmates to injure another one dash. But I didn't. Don't lie, kid. There are witnesses that declared seeing you brainwash Kanda Katsuro before ordering him to push Mikami Eiji in the traffic. Witnesses? Let me guess, the witnesses are Kanda himself and his friends. The witnesses' identities are not relevant, now dash. But they're lying. They've been trying to pin so much bullshit on me, they've just been more stupid than usual this time and dash. Enough. I won't tolerate you trying to put the blame on others, you're lucky enough that Mikami didn't die dash. Excuse me, someone behind? Hitoshi asked, clearly talking to Goto. Their voice was young-sounding, but it might simply be high-pitched too. Officer Goto stopped talking suddenly, his mouth shutting close, which was quite surprising to Hitoshi. The man didn't seem of the type to let anyone walk over him, but here he was, silent as a grave all of the sudden because someone said, "Excuse me." That's an unexpected development. Midoriya, Goto spoke again, a respectful yet slightly tense twinge in his voice. What brings you here? You're usually on the upper levels, no? Superior? Hitoshi mused inwardly. The cop seemed somewhat nervous, so it must be it. Especially since he's using such a respectful suffix. Whoever Midoriya was, they managed to tune down Goto's ego. Hitoshi would be lying if he said he wasn't curious of the newcomer's identity. But he didn't look up. It would be of no use in the end. The moment they looked at the file, they would brush it off as the villain kid being the villain kid. It had happened often enough with a variety of different adults, including some of his past foster parents, for Hitoshi to know that it never went in his favor. To them, he was born a villain because of something he had no control over, and that set him off. Usually, I just went to collect the results of the analyses of the evidences of an ongoing investigation. But I think Detective Tsukachi can wait a bit longer for me to close that file for you. Hitoshi frowned. The voice was really young, to the point where if he didn't know better, he would have assumed that they were no older than he was. And what was that about, close the case for Goto? That sounded suspiciously against the rules. What? I don't mean to offend you, but it's my task, and you have so much more important stuff to do upstairs. I wouldn't want to burden you with a low-level case like this one. It's a quickly closed one too. The kid used his quirk on a classmate to hurt another one. It's as simple as that. That's where you're wrong, Goto-san. What do you mean? I've not been in the bullpen for long, but it was enough for me to understand that you're currently doing a very poor job. You're letting your bigoted ideas get the better of you. You didn't even contact the guardians of your so-called suspect, which, you're aware I hope, you're required to do when you're interrogating a minor. So you're going to go take a break and let me wrap this up. But everything points toward Shinso Hitoshi being responsible for the incident. Let me see. The person shuffled over to Goto and leaned on the desk by the computer, giving Hitoshi his first look of this. Midoriya-san, as the teen began typing away under the officer's scrutinizing gaze. Because yes, they were a teenager. There was no way this Midoriya person was any older than him. With their moss-colored curls, their round emerald eyes and their freckled cheeks, Midoriya looked like the textbook definition of a child. They had this juvenile appearance that couldn't possibly be that of an adult, and yet, they came in there and started ordering a literal cop around with a surprisingly firm authority. Midoriya was an intriguing individual, that was for sure. Hitoshi snapped out of his thoughts when the other teen turned the screen in a way that allowed both Goto and Hitoshi to see whatever it was he had to show them. Immediately, he recognized what they were shown. It was the street where the incident had happened, but looked down onto, probably from the point of view of a camera of some kind. There, on the sidewalk, Hitoshi recognized himself and the few others from his school who had been present at the moment it took place. Midoriya must have gone back through the security footage of the day then. They pressed play, and the video started, the cars appearing from one side of the frame before disappearing in the other. The recording played for a few more seconds before they could see Kanda make a step forward to push Mikami into the traffic. It doesn't dash. Prove that the suspect didn't use his quirk on him. I know, Midoriya interrupted him. But I am sure that if you took the time to read the suspect's file you would find that it's written that his quirk manifests in the victim by a change of color of the pupils. You would have known if you had followed the procedure, Goto-san, but I can see that you didn't. And now, if we go back a few seconds and zoom in, we can see that Kanda's pupils are still very much black, showing that he wasn't under the influence of Shinso's quirk. There's no need trying to justify your actions, Goto-san. Now, I will be completing this file for you, you're free to leave. You can however expect to be called in Tsuragami-san's office once I bring your poor performance to his attention. Have a good day, Goto-san. The officer hesitated for a bit longer before promptly storming out of the bullpen, earning him the curious glances of his colleagues. Once the poor excuse of a man had left, Midoriya took the situation in hands. Carefully, they took off the cuffs from Hitoshi's wrist, who stared at the other curiously as they struggled with the key. It's only once it was done that they sat down in the chair that had previously been occupied by Goto. Midoriya smiled shyly at him. Sorry about him. It's nothing new, Hitoshi shrugged. Yeah, I get that, he chuckled. I'm Midoriya Izuku him, by the way, he introduced himself, extending his hand for Hitoshi to shake. After a short hesitation he took it. Shinso Hitoshi him. Midoriya smiled at him one more time before starting to scribble what must be the report of the incident. Hitoshi let him do so, watching him as he filled the sheet with his chicken scratch. It didn't take him long as he completed the task with practiced ease, but it's not until after he slammed a colorful post-it on top of it, it was a hot pink one, that read, "Check in with Goto for quirk discrimination," in bold characters that he looked back up at him. And that's all, he exclaimed as he stood up, the other doing the same. Hitoshi hummed. You're quite young to work here, he remarked. It's not, I don't really work here. Well, I'm not a police officer. And I'm not that young, I'm 13. Yeah, no, that's pretty young. And what are you then if not a policeman? I'm a consultant. And speaking of which, I still have to bring that upstairs, he said, gesturing to the manila folder that must contain the analysis results he had mentioned earlier. You'll be fine to find your way out? If not, I can find someone to show you the way, but Tsukachi-sen must be growing impatient. Yeah, sure, don't worry. I'll call my foster parents to get them to pick me up. You can go back to your not working here, Mr. Consultant. Izuku rolled his eyes, but didn't say anything about it. Bye, he called out instead before promptly turning around and running toward the nearest staircase. Hitoshi watched him go without a word. It's not like he could have anyway. Izuku was out of his sight before he could even think to say goodbye back. He answered my question, he whispered, quietly enough not to be heard by those still in the bullpen. Silently, Hitoshi turned around and left the office space and walked toward what he remembered to be the main entrance, the police station, still deep in his thoughts. He couldn't help but think about the fact that Izuku had answered him. He knew what his quirk was, and yet he still answered despite knowing what could have happened. No one had answered his question since his quirk appeared, not until he met his current foster family. Somehow, Izuku was different than the others. Maybe he would accept to become Hitoshi's friend? But one thing at a time. Fishing his phone out of his pocket, he hit the phoning app and scrolled through his contacts until he found his foster dad's number. He clicked on it and brought it to his ear as he waited for the man to pick up. "Hitoshi, are you alright? Usually you're home by now." Hitoshi almost sighed in relief when he heard Aizawa's voice. He didn't know what he would have done if he hadn't answered. With Yamada still patrolling at this hour, he would have been short on options. "Yeah, everything's fine. Could you just come pick me up? I'm at the police station right now." "The police station? Did something happen?" "No." "Well, yeah." He sighed. "It's a long story, I'll tell you once we're home, alright?" Hitoshi took a bite once he finished talking. Aizawa, and by association, Yamada, had wanted to know everything about his short-lived adventure in the police force's custody from the moment he first mentioned being there. Honestly, Hitoshi thought they might have overreacted, but that was apparently an unpopular opinion in the Aizawa-Yamada household. For one, the face of the usually stoic Aizawa had screamed concern when he first got to the precinct. First thing he asked was whether he was alright. The obvious answer had been yes, considering that he was no longer handcuffed, and then he announced that they were ordering takeout for diner. Something that they rarely ever did, considering the strict nutritional plan they had as heroes. Just like that, out of the blue. And not just any takeout too, takeout from Hitoshi's favorite restaurant. Something about comfort foods and whatnot. Apparently that was a thing proper parents did. But anyway, that's beside the point. They ended up, the three of them, sitting around the dining table, food containers spreading the surface, and finally, Hitoshi was asked to explain the day's events. By the time he was finished, Yamada was covering his mouth with his hand. "Toshi, darling, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Hopefully that boy will get what he deserves for what he did." Hitoshi shrugged. "It's fine. And I was told he would be checked into. They already have proof that Kondo was the one who pushed Mikami, so I suppose that means they're going to look if there's more." Which, there was, but he wasn't about to admit that in front of his foster parents. Aizawa nodded. "That would be the procedure. Was the person who told you that the same that intervened?" A nod. "Do you know who it is?" "Anyone from the police force who's not quirkist is good to know for more sensible cases." Hitoshi opened his mouth to answer. He knew the other boy's name after all. But he hesitated before even uttering the first syllable. And honestly, he wasn't sure what brought him to lie, not the author searching to patch the plot hole. "What do you mean?" But here he was. "No, I'm not sure. But he did seem well respected though. It's not like Midoriya's name or age was relevant in any way, is it?" Aizawa Shota's life, contrary to popular belief, is quite organized. He leaves for his nightly patrol after having dinner with his family, finishes around 2 or 3 in the morning, it depends on the night, crashes at the precinct to complete his reports of that shift before going back home to catch a few hours of sleep and then going to teach at UA. It might not be really healthy, but so far it worked just fine. And rarely did he stray from that schedule. Today was one of those days where his night turned out to be longer than expected. Usually, that would mean that he would need to go through his day without sleep. Well, no sleep aside from a few naps in between each class. On any other day, he would still have needed to class despite the rough night. Thankfully for him though, this wasn't any other night. The sport festival had taken place only a few days prior, which meant that his students were home and recovering from the event. With no students waiting for him back at UA, Shota could allow himself to sleep all day long, spend more time with his husband, cuddle with his cats and hang out with his kid longer before he had to leave for his next patrol. Once he finished the paperwork. With a coffee in his hand, Shota was busy staring at the sheet of paper he had yet to fill. He was leaning heavily on the desk he sat at in the bullpen, his head in his free hand, already yearning for the sleep he had yet to get. That was one of the reasons why he so rarely went out of his way like that. He needed the little sleep he was used to function. Otherwise, he needed coffee. A lot of coffee, preferably rich in caffeine. Strong coffee, that's what he needed. Glancing distastefully at his paper cup, he decided that the thing was made available in the precinct wouldn't be enough to get him through the task at hand. He needed something stronger. Hopefully Tsukachi wouldn't care too much if Shota helped himself to his coffee stash. If not, He would just make it up with a drink from the nearby cafe. He knew for a fact the detective loved that place. And so did his son. Not that he approved of the 13 drinking coffee, but he wasn't really one to talk. His choice made, Shota left the desk and the stacks of paper behind and trailed toward Tsukachi's office. If he recalled well, the coffee ground was in the second drawer to the left. Tiredly, he made his way through the seemingly endless hall, walking past the numerous door, the empty conference rooms, and the one with a child writing away in a notebook at the table with only one objective in mind. Wait, a child? Going back, Shota stopped in front of the windows to the conference room where, indeed, there was a child sitting at the massive table, bent over a notebook and actively filling the pages. He blinked a few times before straight up rubbing his eyes, but to no avail. The kid was still there and still scribbling all over the empty pages. Going through his memories, he tried to recall if today was a free day for all schools. Then he could brush it off as being some officer who brought his kid to work. But no, it couldn't be. He clearly recalled Hitoshi complaining about an English test he had to do today. There was school, but for some reason, this teen, they seemed old enough to be wasn't in class. His coffee could wait, he decided as he pushed the door open, catching the kids' attention. They spun their chair toward him, frowning at the intrusion at first, but it wasn't long before their eyes widened in surprise and excitement. And before Shota could say anything, they had already began to ramble. "You're Eraserhead. I knew you came here often to do your paperwork, but you're usually gone before I get in, so I never thought I would actually ever meet you. You're one of my favorite heroes. Mostly because you fight mostly quirkless, there's not many other heroes who do, and it's really inspiring for people like me, but there's also so many other reasons. Your quirk for one is really impressive. It doesn't work on mutation quirks, right? Usually when you fight against villains with mutations, you immediately go to the offensive rather than erasing their quirk like you usually do against emitter types. Does it work if you're looking at the villain through a reflective surface, like a mirror for example? I've always wondered that. It could be real useful for sneak attacks if it worked. Is it rough on your eyes? That's a stupid question, obviously it is. You keep your eyes open to use your quirk, that must cause dryness. Do your goggles work as a support item to keep them hydrated as you fight? Or are they only to protect your eyes and mask the red shine of your quirk? And your scarf, I think you call it your capture weapon? I've always wondered how it worked. It must demand such a level of mastery. What is it even made of? It must be a quite tough material if it manages to restrain villains like it does without breaking. The longer the kid spoke, the faster and lower in volume it was, and after a while, Shota could barely hear them, let alone comprehend them. What he had caught so far was however enough for him to understand what was going on. They were analyzing him. At least, that's what the beginning of their rant had sounded like. And the worst about it was that it wasn't even half bad. Sure, he only caught a word out of 10 right now, but they still somehow knew a terrifying amount of things about it, from his fighting style to the drawbacks of his quirk. They must have seen some of his fights, might it be footage or else, it was the only explanation, but the majority of what they said sounded like questions and theories, which brought him to think that none of that was something someone had told them. Shota had the growing certainty that they had came up with all of that on their own. And wasn't that kind of terrifying? This kid, who he knew nothing about, somehow figured out facts about him that some seasoned pros and villains could never even dream to learn. A kid who was in the middle of a precinct while he should have been at school. He needed to know more about them. Just to be sure that he could trust them with this knowledge, nothing else. Kid dash. The door slammed open at that moment, and in came Tsukachi, holding 2 paper cups and with an important amount of folders tucked under his arm. "Hey Midoriya, I've brought the coffee. Oh, hey Eraser." "Tsukachi-hin," the kid Midoriya, apparently, exclaimed, finally snapping out of his mumbling trance. "You're a lifesaver, I swear. I don't know what I would do without coffee." "Sleep, probably," the detective snorted as he handed them one of the cups. He placed down the files on the table before taking a sip of his own drink. "You know, sleep is overrated," they replied. They took a sip of the coffee before putting the cup down. "You know them?" Shota finally asked Tsukachi. "Yeah, he works here as a consultant," he answered, gesturing toward the kid, who held up the card that was on his lanyard, and sure enough, The piece of plastic identified him as a legit consultant for the police department. On it was printed a picture of the child, his name, Midoriya Izuku, his pronouns, he, him, and the name of his job. Like Tsukachi mentioned it, it was consultant. I was starting to wonder if you two would ever come across each other, with you coming in early in the morning and Midoriya being here much later. But isn't he supposed to be at school by this time of the day? School's boring, the teen answered. You're making it seem like you're skipping school. Tsukachi rolled his eyes. Midoriya's actually a genius, and the classes he misses while being here have no impact on his grades, so his mom and the principal of his school allowed him to come here occasionally instead, he then explained. I'm not that dash. Yes, you are Midoriya. Stop arguing. All right, he muttered. Aizawa hummed in response. At least the kid wasn't skipping school. Well, he technically was, but in an okay way. But what are you doing up here, Eraser? Usually, you stay in the bullpen. I just came here for your coffee, Tsukachi scoffed at that, but then I saw your consultant child and got curious. Yeah, you're not the first one to. He does really good analysis. It's not dash, Midoriya tried again. I know, that's why I hired him. Have you ever thought of getting him an analyst license? Shota asked. I'm sure many pros would be ready to pay to have his analysis. Well, yeah, but he's still a kid. I didn't want to surcharge him with work. Wait, I could do that? Midoriya exclaimed, surprised. Tsukachi eyed him, almost wearily, before answering. I don't see why not. But like I just said, you're just 13 dash. Like you just said, Tsukachi-san, I'm a genius, he said, making the quotation marks with his fingers, and I have nothing else to do with my time. Well, if you're sure. I already do it in my free time, it wouldn't be that big of a change. All right then. He sighed, defeated. You could go and ask Tsuragami about it? On it. Thanks, Tsukachi-san. Goodbye, Eraserhead-san. And with that, Midoriya suddenly stood up, sending the chair rolling away, and promptly left the room, leaving Shota and Tsukachi behind. The detective kept looking at the closed door for a few seconds before shaking his head at the teen's antics. He'll probably be back later, so might as well get a head start, he thought as he started sorting the manila folders. Shota though kept looking at where Midoriya had stood just a moment ago. If Tsukachi had hired him, he must be trustworthy enough for him to let the kid be despite his extensive knowledge. He had potential. That much was obvious. He still didn't know much about the young consultant, other than his name and age, but if he really was as smart as Tsukachi implied he was, then he was sure that he would go far, especially with his skills. He's going to do great things, isn't he? That he is, Tsukachi snorted fondly. Annoyingly enough, Izuku hadn't expected that getting himself an analyst license would take that look. It's just a tiny piece of plastic, it should be quick enough, right? But no, obviously not. It's been about a week since Eraserhead first gave him the idea to pursue his hobby as a career and he asked Tsuragami about it, and yet there was still no progress. But he could wait. Sure, it was annoying and he would like to get it faster, but it was out of his control. There was plenty of work for him to do for the meantime anyway. So Izuku did just that, spending more and more of his time at the precinct to keep himself busy. He didn't spend all of his time there though. That would make him a very bad son if he couldn't free a bit of time in his schedule for his mother. There was also school, obviously, but the subjects they covered in middle school were just so easy to him. Most of the time, he only went when there was exams, otherwise spending his days in the conference room turned his office. It's not like he had any other reasons to go anyway. He didn't have any friends that would miss him, and as a bonus, he didn't have to deal with the bullies if he didn't go to school. So really, it was a win-win situation, more time to work as a consultant, and less dealing with overpowered quirkist JRKS. This day, like most were as of recently, was yet again one where he chose to stay as far as possible from Aldra Junior High to instead catch wanted criminals with the local police. They had been quite productive so far, and as the end of the afternoon was nearing, Izuku decided to take what was essentially his first break of the day. No, Izuku, jugging an energy drink in between two leads does not count as a break. So, since he was banned from the conference room for the next hour or so, it really wasn't necessary, Tsukachi. He made his way down the stairs. Thankfully, he already had an idea of where to go. There was a nice cafe nearby in which he could do some analysis until he was allowed back on the case. Coincidentally, it was also the moment at which Shinso Hitoshi entered the lobby of the police station. It had been weeks since he last came here, and in all honesty, he was kind of nervous to be back. What if that Goto JRK was there and tried to lock him up again? But he was still there, and that despite the anxiety. All of that because of Midoriya-san. He couldn't help but think about him. It was ridiculous, really, how being in the same room as him for around 20 minutes was enough to make him this obsessed with the other boy, but he couldn't help it. He simply had so many questions. For one, this kid, because Hitoshi was sure that he couldn't be older than him, somehow managed to intimidate a cop. He wasn't dumb, Goto was obviously on edge because of him. He scared the man away before completing the report himself. He was obviously important, somehow, despite only being a teen. But that wasn't even the most important. While he did want to ask about this weird authority he seemed to have within the precinct, there was another question he wanted the answers to desperately. Hitoshi wanted to know why this Midoriya guy acted this way toward him despite knowing of his quirk. Because he had to know. He read his file. He even went as far as to use a telltale sign of his quirk to prove his innocence. He talked with him normally afterward, despite the fact that he must have known that his quirk was activated by speech. Midoriya knew what he was capable of, and yet he treated him like no one but his current foster parents had before. Midoriya Izuku hadn't cared about his quirk, and he wanted to know why. Among other things. So it's with that in mind that he directly made his way toward the precinct once he finished school. The way was longer than it was from his previous junior high, but thankfully trains could bring you about anywhere nowadays. Hi, he greeted the man at the front desk. I was wondering if, Midoriya Izuku was around. I'm right here, someone explained before the cop could answer. Turning around, Hitoshi's gaze landed on Midoriya who, by the pure chance, seemed to be on his way out. He looked like he was getting about just as much sleep as Hitoshi did, wore a t-shirt on which the word, pants, was printed and had a bright yellow backpack hanging from one of his shoulder. Basically, he looked more like a guy who just got out of bed rather than someone who is heading out of work. Was there a problem? No, I just wanted to talk. Shinso, it was his name if Izuku recalled well, which he usually did, sounded unsure. He hummed. Alright. Is it alright if we talk as we walk then? Sure I guess. Great, he exclaimed, smiling warmly at him. He waved at his colleague and soon after they were outside, walking among the crowd. They walked in silence for a moment. Izuku was quite relaxed, scrolling through the news feed on his phone, but he could feel that Shinso was tense and confused beside him. He didn't force him to talk though, instead giving him all the time he could need. Which apparently was 4 minutes 37 seconds, according to his phone's clock. Where are we going? He asked tentatively. A nearby cafe. I like to spend my breaks there. I thought you were leaving for the day, Shinso frowned. Oh no, I'm far from finished. I'll probably hang around for a few more hours, I'm just going out for my mandatory break. I didn't know the police gave mandatory breaks. They don't, Izuku snorted. I'm a special case. Supervisor kicks me out for an hour if I spend too much time in the precinct. And since I've been there since 6:30 this morning, well here I am, he grinned at his companion. 6:30 in the morning. Don't you have school or something? Not really. I only go when there are exams, otherwise I'd rather spend all of my time in the precinct. It's much more interesting than a middle school. Oh, it's here. They stopped in front of a narrow building made of discolored bricks. There was a large sign proclaiming Le Scale, Thes et Cafés Artisanos, above the white window awning with rainbow stripes. The front door was painted in a bright yellow and there were flower pots beside it. You come here too? Shinso asked, sounding surprised. Of course. Their coffee is to die for, and honestly, I have a soft spot for their pastries. Now, come on in. Izuku pushed the door to the cafe open, causing the bell to chime loudly in the small shop. Inside, they found themselves in a warm and welcoming bistro. There were a few tables spread around the damaged wooden flooring, and most of the chairs placed around them were mismatched. Colorful painting covered the walls, and he knew from exterminating them in the past that they were all made by local artists. There was a strong smell of freshly brewed coffee in the air, covering almost entirely the more discreet scent of the sugary pastries that were displayed behind the glass counter. This place would make anyone hungry by simply entering. And if Izuku had been only slightly hungry before, he would now eat everything the employees had to offer after being exposed to the savory fragrances. "Good afternoon, what can I do for you today?" They were greeted by the barista behind the counter. Renard Sylvester, as was indicated by her name tag, which also sported her pronouns, she, her, seemed to be working there 24. Any regular could expect to develop some kind of friendship with her, and Izuku was proud to say that he was one of them. Talking with her was always interesting too. You could say there was more to her than she let on simply by looking at her. With her heavy red curls brought up into a Viking-like hairstyle, her left eye covered by an eye patch and the extensive scars on the shoulders, she looked like an adventurer. She did have a new adventure to share each time Izuku visited too. He smiled at her. "Hey Renard, I'll take." Once they had ordered, they sat at a table by a window at the front of the shop. Izuku sipped his latte peacefully, eyeing Shinso, who kept staring into his cup. It had tiny cat ears on the rim, of coffee like it had the answers to the biggest questions in the universe rather than drink his beverage. The green-haired teen took a bite in his pastry before starting the conversation. "So, you wanted to ask me something, right?" "Yeah." "Go on then, I'm all ears." He nervously swallowed a gulp of his coffee, despite it being fuming, obviously searching for a way to put what he wanted to say into words. "You answered my questions." "I did, that's what you usually do when someone asks you a question." "But you know what my quirk is, you know what I'm capable of. Why would you do that?" "Because dash." Suddenly, Izuku felt as if he had lost control over his body. He was cut mid-sentence, unable to get the next words out, frozen in motion despite his best attempts to snap out of it. His body was numb to his environment all off the sudden and sight became clouded, though Shinso remained clear while the rest of the cafe was slightly blurred. The sound of Renard working behind the counter was muffled, not unlike how it would have been if he had been held underwater, but he heard Shinso clearly when he told him to make a plane with the paper towel. And he obeyed. Despite being unable to control his body by himself, Izuku saw his hands listen to the given order and fold the napkin into a plane. And then, as quickly as it had started, it was finished. Everything snapped back into focus. The ambient sound of the cafe, Renard knocking cups together behind the counter, other customers talking at nearby tables, flooded his ears. Everything was back, including the control over his body, he noted when he raised his hand to eye level to see the paper plane he was holding. "That was so cool." "That what?" "Your quirk is so cool. There's so much you could do with it. Have you ever tried to brainwash someone out of their panic attack? I bet you could. Being under your control is so relaxing, I'm sure it would work. Everything feels so distant, so calm. You could even order them to slow their breathing. I don't know for sure for others, but I can tell you it would work for me. Have you ever considered to become a hero? Because I'm sure you could do it. You would make an awesome rescue hero if you could calm down the victims with your brainwashing. You could even brainwash a villain out of committing a crime. It makes me wonder if there truly is any limits of how you could use your quirk in the heroic field. Have you ever tested the limits of your quirk? Do you know how long you can hold someone under your control? Can you brainwash more than one person at a time? If yes, is there a limit of how many? Imagine if you could brainwash a whole crowd by talking in a speaker. But then you would need to be able to deceive villains. Contrary to popular belief, some of them are quite smart. They wouldn't answer if they recognized your voice. You could probably get yourself a voice changer as your support gear. Maybe even a built-in speaker if you need to brainwash a large amount of people, if it's possible, of course. Then I doubt anyone could beat you in a spar. Are you all right? Because Izuku had just noticed, too focused on his analysis rambling to do so before, but Shinso was staring at him like he had just grown a second head. His eyes were as round as plates, and there was no reaction at Izuku's question. Snapping his fingers in front of the other's eyes, the young consultant finally caught his attention. "That you're not scared?" "What? No, of course not. I think your quirk is fascinating. Why would I be scared? I don't know, everyone is. You're like the third person that I meet who doesn't think it makes me a villain. Well, those who do are a-hole, Izuku huffed, resent clear in his voice. And maybe his tone made it too clear that he knew more about quirkism than he would like to admit, because Shinso caught on it. Are you bullied for your quirk too? Izuku blinked at him. Something like that? And what's that supposed to mean? I'm quirkless. Oh, well, that explains it. I heard that quirkless discrimination was quite harsh. That's one way to put it, Izuku chuckles humorlessly. But it's been a while since I've had to deal with it. There's a no-tolerance policy in the precinct, so it's safe. Goto-san was transferred after his stunt of last time, by the way. Oh, that's great. But what about before you became? Whatever you call your job in the precinct. Before, it wasn't fun. Most of the time I was told that I was useless, but there was also the occasional suicide baiting. Not that I would tell anyone in the precinct, they'd probably burn my school down for that. They're assholes on top of being blind. Honestly, I doubt any of them could do even half of what you do with the cops. Thanks, he said sadly. Thank you too. There aren't many people I can talk to without being called a villain, so. It was nice talking to you. Same here. Sorry, Tsukachi-san needs my help with something, he exclaimed after reading the notification that just came up on his phone. That's all right, Shinso said. He understood, but honestly he was a little bit disappointed that they couldn't spend more time together at the cafe. Izuku called out an order to Renard as he rummaged through his bag, looking for something and confusing Shinso in the process. Finally, he took out a pen, a bright orange one with glitters, and scribbled something on the paper towel before ending it to the purple-haired teen, who accepted it confusedly. Izuku went to collect and pay the new order before heading toward the door. See you around, he called out before leaving with the awkward charge of 2 paper cups. He got his transferred by the barista, a pastry in a paper bag and his bright yellow backpack. Dumbfounded, Hitoshi watched him walk away until he disappeared around the corner of the street the precinct was on. It's only then that he looked down at the paper he had been given earlier. To his surprise, in bright glittery ink was written a phone number. Izuku, laughing face. XXXXXXXX. He smiled shyly at the few words. He really wouldn't mind having Izuku as a friend. Izuku walked in the precinct this morning with a large, blinding smile on his face and an analysis license in his wallet. Tsuragami had gotten it delivered to his home the day before, and now Izuku was a certified analyst, with the papers to prove it. He happily skipped his way around the building, his contagious good mood making smile everyone he came across. He clocked in, beaming at the officer who was there at the same moment he was, before making his way upstairs and toward his conference room. Because despite the good news, Izuku doubted he would use it anytime soon. He was new after all, so it only made sense that it would take a moment before there would be a high demand for his analysis. Especially since he wasn't affiliated with any kind of analysis agency. It was nice that he worked with the police forces for that, because since he worked closely with heroes in occasions, he could show off his skills on the field. Even then though, it would take time. Izuku therefore expected to go just like any other he had spent working in the precinct until now, clocking in early in the morning, working for hours until Tsukachi deemed he needed a mandatory break, and to be back home for a late meal with his mom and a cup of tea. Just a simple day like any other. The first thing he did as he entered the conference room was to sort the files he had been asked to look at by urgency. Despite still being legally a kid, Izuku was asked to oversee a lot of stuff in the department. Cold cases and elaborate operations were piling on the table, and he needed to know where to start if he didn't want to go insane. Today was no exception, he had noted when he saw the mountain of folders already waiting for him, and that wasn't even counting whatever could happen today. As per usual, it took him about 20 minutes to reorganize his workplace. There were 2 piles of files to look into, separated by cold or ongoing, and ordered by importance. On the other end of the table were, to leave him enough place to work, the 2 piles of cases he was done with. Here again cold and ongoing were separated. Someone should come pick them up eventually. An energy drink and a paper cup of dull coffee were placed by his chair, along with rainbow post-its and a pencil case full of colorful pen. He pulled the chair from under the table and fell heavily in it. Then he was ready to start his work day. However, Izuku barely had the time to open the first folder of the ongoing cases that the door to the conference room was slammed open. Startled, but not surprised by the interruption, Izuku glanced up from his work to see a relatively awake Tsukachi standing in the door frame. So it's not now that he would be able to start looking into those files, was it? Resigned, he leaned back into the chair, keeping his eyes on the detective as he did so. "Good morning, Tsukachi-san," he greeted him as he took the coffee off the table to hand it to the man. He seemed to need it more than he did. And as a matter of fact, he took the drink gratefully. "Thank you, Midoriya. I worked later than usual yesterday, didn't sleep much." He sighed. "Today's going to be a long day." "I can see that. So, what brings you there? I assume it's not just my coffee, right?" "You're right." He sighed again. "You've been requested in Kyushu." Tsukachi took a sip of the coffee and sighed in content. He seemed to be sighing a lot this morning. "Requested? In Kyushu?" he asked as he spun slowly in his chair. "Usually I don't travel for work. What's different this time, Dash? Is it for analysis work?" "As a matter of fact, yes it." "This soon? I would have expected it would take a while longer before I would get to be requested anywhere." "Well, you see, what happened is that apparently Eraserhead mentioned you as being a promising analyst once to a few colleagues of his, who then somehow heard of you officially getting your analyst license, and now here we are." Izuku turned red at the fact that Eraserhead, pro-hero Eraserhead of all people, had thought he had enough potential to be worth mentioning. His brain had short-circuited at the indirect praise, and it took him a moment to be back to a lucid enough state that he was able to connect the dot. He's still as red as a tomato, but he's capable of coherent thoughts, so it's as good as it would get right now. "Wait, if I got this request because Eraserhead mentioned me to a few colleagues who's apparently based in Kyushu, doesn't that mean Dash? Is it Dash? If you're thinking Hawk's Hero Agency, then yes, it's where you're going. Hawks asked the help of an analyst for something, yours specifically. Dash. I think you should get going if you don't want to miss the 8:30 train to Kyushu, the detective mentioned offhandedly. "Sheet, you're right," Izuku exclaimed after checking the time. "See you later, Tsukachi-san." "Good luck, kid," the detective called out. Izuku gathered his things quickly, throwing everything in his backpack before promptly leaving. If he had to turn around the second he stepped out to go clock out, no one said a thing about it. Despite stopping by La Scale on the way to the train station to replace the coffee he had given Tsukachi, Izuku still managed to catch the train in time. He doubted his mother would approve of him taking the train by himself to Kyushu, but oh well, it was a bit too late for that. Hawks was waiting for him after all, there was no time for him to ask for a chaperone. For the whole time the ride took, he had been a living bundle of anxiety. The fact that he downed both the coffee and the energy drink probably didn't help with that, but what can you do? In the end, he still got to the building housing Hawk's Hero Agency, if it is after a bathroom break. But no matter. Izuku now stood on the sidewalk next to the skyscraper the wing hero had chosen for his base of operation. He looked up, squinting to try and see its slanted top through the blinding sunlight. The glass walls, however, reflected the light and did no more than burn his eyes more than the sun already did. After a moment of pointlessly trying, he finally gave up and resigned himself to go in. Hawks must be waiting for him, after all. So he tightened his grip on his backpack straps, took in a deep breath in an attempt to ground himself, and pushed the glass door open. Inside, he was welcomed by the sight of a modern-looking reception. The floor was made of marble tiles and an impressive chandelier hung from the high ceiling. Many business people fast-walked from one side to the other of the hall, a briefcase under their arm. Some were waiting for the elevator, some were talking with the receptionists or each other while others were trailing for the staircase. Right, he recalled, the lower levels were offices used by whatever business. Hesitantly, and obviously anxiously as well, Izuku crossed the distance between the door and the front desk. The person behind it seemed busy, and he really didn't want to bother them, but he really needed indications to find his way. Excuse me, Dash, he stuttered. They turned toward him, a phone against their ear. The badge on their chest became visible at that moment, reading, she/her. She held a finger in his direction, and Izuku was more than happy to wait for her to finish her call. Maybe the delay would give him the time to come up with what to say. He laughed at himself inwardly. His colleagues back at the precinct would be surprised to see him this anxious over a social interaction. The Midoriya they knew spoke his mind and never hesitated to correct them when they are wrong. But that was because Izuku was familiar with them. He knew that they respected him and his opinions, that they encouraged him, wanted him to speak up. This Midoriya existed within the building of the police station and nowhere else. This was because they were among the very few individuals who respected him as an individual. His peers and teachers thought him to be lesser than them because of his quirklessness. And with the years, he came to assume that the same was true for the rest of the world. It was simply safer that way. The risks were a lot less important if he never lowered his guard to begin with. And of course he knew that the police forces weren't like that. At least, his precinct wasn't, otherwise, he wouldn't allow himself to act the way he did with them. But he would rather not be victim of quirkless discrimination everywhere he went if he could avoid it. Finally, the receptionist bid farewell to whoever was on the other end of the call and placed it down on the desk. She turned back toward him and flashed him her customer service smile. "Hello, sweetie, what can I do for you?" I wanted to know how to access the Hawks Hero Agency." "Did you need the help of the heroes?" "No, I am expected." "You are?" "The only person I heard was expected today was an analyst." "What was their name again?" "Akagi." "What's the name of the analyst Hawk-san said was supposed to come today?" "Midoriya Izuku," one of her colleagues replied without even glancing their way. "Right, that's the one." "So I'm sorry, sweetie, but that's me." Sorry for interrupting you, but I'm Midoriya Izuku." "Really?" She frowned. "You seem quite young to be an analyst. The ones I've seen are old men. Do you perhaps have your license with you for me to verify?" "Why, yeah, of course." He awkwardly got his bag of his back and fumbled through its content as he searched for his wallet. Once he got his hand on it, he flipped it open and showed off his freshly acquired license to the lady, who took it out of his hand to have a better look at it. "You really are an analyst then? I didn't know they made them this young nowadays. But anyway." She gave him back his wallet, along with a red lanyard, yes, another one, on which was printed in a gold font Hawks and his sidekick's name. From it hung an ID pass on which was written Midoriya Izuku, analyst, and 2 small red rubber wings. After a moment spent staring at the newly acquired identity card, he looked up from it to look back at the receptionist, confusion and shock written all over his features. "You'll need that to have access to the 60th floor, on which is Hawks Hero Agency's reception," she answered to his silent question. "Get in the elevator and press on the 60th button. You'll only have to scan it once you've reached the floor to be given access. Someone should be waiting for you up there." "Wait," someone exclaimed, the Akagi person from earlier Izuku realized, as she rolled in their direction on her chair. She also sported a she/her pin. "He's really going up there?" "It looks like it." "Good luck then, kid." Thanks." He bowed at them before scurrying away, toward the elevator this time. Thankfully, the door opened just as he was getting there. He hurried in and shyly pressed the right button, the ID in his wallet held tightly in his right hand. "He's cute," remarked Akagi once. The elevator closed on him, making sure that he couldn't hear them even if he had an enhanced hearing type of quirk. The only reply she got from her colleague was a sigh and a swat to the side of her head with a rolled magazine. Izuku, the last one left in the elevator when he finally reached the 60th floor. There it stopped moving and a robotic voice resonated in the small cabin, asking him to scan his ID on the screen on the door's left. It's only once he did so, shakily admittedly, that the doors slid open, revealing the Hawks Hero Agency's first floor. The place was pretty busy, though a lot less than the building's reception had been. It was the polar opposite to the wide, cool gray hall he had just left, with its warm colors and barely noticeable neglect. There was a large staircase giving access to the upper levels, a lounging area, 6 vending machines and a small desk. No doubt the reception Akagi's colleague had mentioned was right by the elevator. But before Izuku could even think of going toward the man reading a manga, His leg on the desk he was meant to work at, something or someone grabbed his shoulders from behind. He flinched away and turned to see what or who it was. He felt his eyes widen when they set on no other than the wing hero himself. To say that Izuku was shocked to see the man wouldn't be right. No, because he had expected the possibility to see the man from afar. It was his agency after all. It would have been foolish of him to expect otherwise. What he hadn't expected though was for the man to come to him directly, as if he wasn't a simple analyst. Hawks-san. That's me. Though you can drop the honorific, just Hawks is fine. And you must be Midoriya Izuku, the famous analyst. I'm glad you could make it. Not famous though. Izuku argued weakly. But you should be. I'm not joking really. When I heard Eraser talk about you, I knew I needed to at least meet you, maybe try to bribe you into joining my team while I'm at it. Eraserhead doesn't praise lightly, you know? Oh, he replied intelligently, feeling his cheeks redden. But anyway, I didn't call you here to tell you how cool you are, now did I? Follow me, let's go to somewhere a bit more discreet. Still stunned by the fact that Eraserhead apparently went around telling other heroes that he supposedly had potential, Izuku let the energetic young man guide him toward the upper levels without putting a fight. He's finally released when they reach a conference room that wasn't unlike the one he used back at the precinct, if it wasn't that it was larger and more modern looking. So, Hawks began as he walked toward a powered-up laptop on the other side of the table, closely followed by Izuku, the reason that I've called you here today. We've been investigating a local drag ring recently. They seem to be selling some kind of off-brand trigger, though that doesn't make it any less destructive. You know what trigger is, right? They've been having problems with it in Narahata, right? Still do actually, but they have heroes on site to take care of it, so it allows me and my team to try and stop the ring that appeared in our town. I see. And what you needed me to analyze is related to that. Precisely. Actually, we managed to get footage of a few individuals who we know are part of the organization. We suspect they might also be of high ranking, they're probably close to the leader too. And since we're planning on raiding their headquarters sooner than later, we decided to get an analyst to try and figure out their quirks. It would give us an advantage. And how much footage have you gathered exactly? Not much, Hawks grimaced. They're annoyingly slippery. We'll do with what we've got then. I like you attitude. Take your seat, he exclaimed as he pulled the chair in front of the computer, inviting Izuku to sit down, which he did as he pulled a notebook and a pen from his bag. And begin. Hawks pressed play and Izuku leaned forward to see better on the small screen. His eyes were glued on the video and his hand was running on the paper. His lips were moving silently, his mutter being way too fast quiet for Hawks to actually understand a bit of it. The hero stood by the side and watched dumbfounded as this preteen? He looked really young, somehow filled a page at light speed. Eraserhead really hadn't kidding when he said that the kid had potential, he realized. Izuku was smart, that much was obvious. Heck, Hawks wouldn't even be surprised if someone told him he had a genius sitting in his conference room. He was fast too, it didn't seem to take him long to figure whatever out. And just like that, the video came to an end. Izuku leaned back in the chair and set the pen down. So, what do you think? Do you need to rewatch it? I've already got an idea, but I could use a second viewing or 3 just to make sure. When Eraserhead had brought up the possibility of Izuku becoming a licensed analyst, the teen had only thought of it as one more way to do his hobby. He knew he would get paid, like he was getting paid for his work at the precinct. What he hadn't known though was how quickly it would have grown out of proportion. The fact that it had only taken hours for the number 3 hero himself to get in contact with him for an analysis job was still unbelievable to him. He was a child for Cammy's sake. Not once had he thought that any hero would take him seriously, especially right away. And it seemed to be way more than a simple one-time thing since he had left the Hawks Hero Agency that night with the lanyard and the security pass in his bag. He slid it in a hidden pocket, the same one he kept the ID he used at the precinct in, the moment he was out of the building. It was an entry ticket to an hero agency. It would be a shame if someone ill-disposed was to get their hands on it. But Cammy apparently had a pretty twisted sense of humor, since there he was, a difficult week and countless hours of work later, on his way to Night Eye Agency, anxious and tired. It was truly a miracle that he somehow managed to sit down and do his jobs after receiving a call from Sir Night Eye himself, who was asking for his services. At this point, Izuku really was wondering what was his life, because apparently, Sir had decided to ask for him after hearing about him from Hawks. Since the raid Izuku had done analysis for had been a success, not that the teen hadn't been made aware of that fact the moment the wing hero was back in his agency, Sir had made the decision that he could help him with a quirk-related issue. It became quite obvious at that moment that the reason for his success would be hero gossips, and that was a fact he wasn't quite sure of what to do with. But anyhow, Sir Night Eye had only asked him to rejoin him at his agency the next week, which had left Izuku plenty of time to look through the requests of other heroes Hawks had shared his good opinion of him with. This, added to his already existing workload back at the precinct, gave him plenty of things to do as he waited for the day of his meeting with Sir, while also putting his restless energy to good use. It began simply. Izuku simply read the files he was asked to, correcting what needed to be, pointing out what no one else had noticed, and doing the analyses a variety of heroes had demanded him to do for them. It was supposed to be a fairly simple week, especially since he didn't need to go to school at all. The only thing he had to worry about was his upcoming job at Night Eye Agency. Everything was however thrown out of the window when he received a mail from his math teacher, informing him of an unplanned test that he needed to be present for. That threw a wrench in his plans, but oh well. And of course it wouldn't have been fun if there weren't more problems ready to fall on him at any moment, because Stain just had to drop yet another body the day before his math test. And with him being a stubborn perfectionist overachiever, he just had to work on it, trying to find non-existent clues. And why not spend the whole night up trying to figure out whatever pattern the hero killer might be following? To say that Izuku looked tired the next morning would be an understatement. The teen entered the school looking like death itself and sipping the deadly mix of coffee and energy drink he prepared for himself before leaving. No one, not even Bakugo, dared to even look at him the wrong way. His poor state of mind didn't stop him from acing the test though. All of this to say that, as he was getting off the train to get to the agency, Izuku was still tired out of his mind by his unexpectedly energy-consuming week, but that didn't stop him from being also both a ball of anxious energy and eager for the new challenge. He walked from the train station to the building, fiddling nervously with an empty can of energy drink. His brand-new identity card, attached on an All Might-themed lanyard this time, was securely tucked away in his bag. There was no use to get it out right now. He wouldn't need it before getting to the agency's front door anyway. Sir had obviously thought ahead a lot more than Hawks had done, and forwarded the pass to the precinct, so Izuku would be able to get in by himself. It sort of was an obligation too, since there wasn't a reception at the bottom floor of the building where he could have fetched the plastic card like there was at Hawks' agency. The building that housed the Night Eye Agency was fairly different from the one Hawks' Hero Agency was based in, or so said his researches on the matter. While Hawks only had the top floors of the skyscraper for his agency to use, Night Eye owned the whole building, though he did rent a few offices to other groups he worked closely with, such as support companies and analysts. Which brings the question as to why did Sir Night Eye need him to come here if he already has analysts in the building? Izuku finally reached the agency, and looking at his phone for the time, was relieved to see that he was a few minutes in advance. He went for the door, next to which was a scanner, probably used to scan the cards he guessed, and so he opened his bag to find said object. He had just gotten it out when he heard the sound of someone running in his direction. Turning around, Izuku saw that it was a blonde teen, visibly a few years older than him and out of breath. They came to a stop next to him, took a deep breath, and went to scan their own card when they noticed him, standing there and staring up at them with wide eyes. "You're new here?" they asked, taking note of the similar-looking plastic card he was still holding. "Awaya. Nice to meet you then. I'm Togata Mirio, he/him, but you can just call me Mirio." Mirio introduced himself as he bowed slightly. "Are you an intern too?" "Midoriya Izuku he/him," Izuku replied, returning the bow respectfully. And no, I'm not an intern. I'm here as an analyst today." "Oh, do you know if someone is expecting your arrival?" Izuku nodded. "In a few minutes actually." "Better not make whoever you're meeting wait then. Just scan your badge." It only took a moment before they were both in the lobby, among the few workers circulating in the large room. If you were awaited, then there must be someone down here to fetch you. Midoriya-san. I'm glad you could make it, someone exclaimed on their left. When we talk of the devil, Izuku heard Mirio mutter beside him. The two teens turned toward the voice just in time to see Bubble Girl, one of Sir Nightai's sidekicks, jump down the last step and jog toward them, toward Midoriya. She stopped by them, bent forward and hands on her knees, and took a few deep breaths. It's good to meet you, Midoriya-san. I'm Bubble Girl, but you must already know that. I have been tasked with bringing you where you'll be needed. Well, I'll leave you to it then. Mirio said. I'm also weighted and wouldn't want to make my mento wait. I hope I'll see you around, Midoriya-san. The blonde bowed one last time and the next second he was gone, leaving Izuku with the enthusiastic sidekick. So, Sir wanted to meet you in the gym, but before that, we'll be doing a detour by the office upstairs. There's some paperwork Sir wants you to fill. Is that all right with you? Not knowing what exactly to reply to that, Izuku simply nodded and followed Bubble Girl toward the elevator this time. Once everything was filled and signed, the blue-skinned sidekick guided him back downstairs, and then underground, toward what must be the gym. It seemed a bit odd at first to have a hero training space in what was basically a basement, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. What better place to train superpowered individuals without having to fear for material damage than under the crust of the earth? After all, he thought. He had been told by Bubble Girl that he would be meeting with Sir Nightai and a trainee, for which he was not given a name. He probably should have guessed the identity of the hero hopeful by then, but he was still surprised to see Mirio stretching on the training mat. Mirio-kun? Izuku said, surprised. Midoriya-san. The older teen turned toward him, surprised. He stopped stretching and instead twisted himself to face him, sitting with his legs crossed. Midoriya-san, greeted Sir Nightai, who Izuku hadn't noticed at first since he had been leaning against a wall. I'm glad you could make it here today. Now that you've joined us, we'll be able to begin. He's the specialist you said you called here to help us, sir? Indeed he is. I've only heard great things about him. Hopefully he'll be able to see what we couldn't. You seem to know him, however. I met him in the hall, sir. I had no idea he was heading to the gym too. Mirio beamed at Izuku, who returned the smile shyly. I see. I'm sorry to interrupt, Sir Nightai, but what was it that you needed me for? It's just that I haven't been made aware why yet. Right. The hero pushed his glasses back on his nose, and Izuku simply knew that it meant they were getting to business. The man invited his sidekick to leave with a vague gesture of the hand, and it's only after Bubble Girl left the room that he spoke again. I've heard from Hawks that you are quite good at breaking down quirks. You're the analyst who helped him take down that drag ring, correct? Why yes. So you're able to find ways to exploit a quirk's weaknesses against its user, but what about helping the person master it? It's pretty much the same thing, sir, so why's? How so? Sir frowned. Izuku stared at him, dumbfounded, for a moment. He thought it was obvious. Well, maybe not to the average citizen, but Sir Nightai was a pro-hero, who worked with analysts on the daily. How he didn't know was a mystery to Izuku. You need to know the weaknesses of a quirk to master it, sir, he finally answered. If not, how is one meant to learn how to overcome them? I can know how to overpower someone by using their weaknesses against them, but I can also show them how to become stronger by eliminating them or making them less obvious. Izuku stayed quiet for a moment after finishing to ramble, but seeing as neither of the older men seemed to know what to say, he spoke again. I assume you wanted me to help one of your people with the control of their quirk? Who might that be? That would be me, Mirio volunteered, looking sheepish. I know it must sound ridiculous that I can't control my quirk at my age, especially since I'm a UA student. Not at all, some quirks can prove to be harder to harness than others. You've got a permeation quirk, right? I've seen you at the sport festival. That's correct. Izuku nodded, more to himself than anyone else. It's quite a powerful quirk, volatile too, but also complex. If my assumptions are correct, it's understandable that you have such a hard time controlling it. The way to overcome its drawbacks isn't quite obvious. You sound like you know what you're talking about, Mirio remarks. Do you also have a quirk of that kind? Hard to figure out. Am quirkless, actually. Oh, he whispered before pulling at his collar consciously. I'm sorry for assuming. It's not a problem. People rarely think that being quirkless is still possible nowadays anyway. I guess you'd know better than me about that, but I still apologize. I shouldn't have assumed, no matter the chances of someone being quirkless. Izuku looked away, feeling the blush creep up his cheeks. He wasn't used to that kind of reaction. How was he supposed to reply to that? Nobody ever apologized for assuming that he had a quirk. They had apologized for him not having a quirk that he knew. He saw the pity in the eyes of those people, and no matter how much he disliked it, he was also used to it. People reacted to his lack of quirk the same way they would be sorry for one's loss. It made him feel like he should be grieving something he never had. Mirio was the very first person to apologize, not for his quirklessness, but for assuming that he wasn't. Even his colleagues back at the precinct, who had underestimated him at the beginning both for his young age and lack of quirk, never apologized for the way they first reacted upon meeting him. Sir Night-Eye cleared his throat. So, Midoriya-san, you seem to already have an idea of how Mirio's quirk works. Do you have a first solution in mind? Maybe, but we'll have to test it out. So, subject, permeation, quirk. The quirk, as is understandable through both the name and official records, grants Togata the ability to phase through solids by turning all or parts of their body intangible. It asks for great bodily control and awareness, as well as quick thinking to plan for every action ahead of time and precisely. Any miscalculation may have great consequences, such as the violent expulsion of Togata's body from whatever matter they had phased through, which might cause bodily harm. While unpredictable in appearances, the possibilities in the uses of permeation are many, making the efforts and the time put toward mastering its subtleties worth it. For examples, refer to the possible derived skills listed down below. Togata could, with great timing and skill, phase through walls and other relatively thin obstacles by phasing their body limb by limb until they fully stand on the other side of the barrier. Such a skill could provide, among other things, a quicker and stealthier way to navigate urban settings. The ability, as previously demonstrated by Togata himself, to propel oneself through the air by phasing through the ground and gaining enough momentum to properly take advantage of this loophole. It could, among other things, allow Togata to travel quickly and efficiently in known territory or use the additional momentum to put more strength behind a hit. Togata could gain the ability to dodge an attack by learning how to predict his opponent's moves. If not a possibility, consider trying to rely on instincts, seeing that it gave acceptable results in other cases. By allowing for the hit to permeate through his body, not only would the user keep his stance, but the opponent would also lose theirs, which would allow for Togata to take advantage of the lapse of attention and/or balance to strike back. With practice, Togata could also learn how to use permeation to perform sneak attacks. Again, timing is the key to the success of this hypothetical maneuver. He would need to permeate through the target for the first punch or kick, only to regain solidity and allow the hit to connect on the way back to his core, effectively hitting the opponent in the back. Unfortunately, there is no easy route or shortcut I can recommend to gain these skills besides dedication and practice. Like most quirk-related techniques, the examples cited above can only be mastered by putting in the effort. However, considering that until now Togata trained blindly and with no idea of his potential abilities, I assume he may be able to progress much faster with a clear goal to attain. Here are, however, suggestions of specific concerns to focus on in the future. To resolve the issue of articles of clothing not following with the user during permeation, I recommend weaving strands of his DNA in the material of his uniforms in an attempt to confuse the quirk into accepting it as being a part of Togata's body. As a way to make up for his inability to carry any type of weapon without losing it when actively using his quirk, the user should look into a variety of martial arts and apply them to his quirk usage as a way to improve his combat skills. Seeing that depending on any other thing is not a possibility, it would greatly improve his chances in battle. The user should also consider the possibility of his quirk failing him while fighting. A quirk such as permeation has, after all, never been seen before in heroics, meaning that this analysis has been conducted without past data or information coming from a source other than Togata to rely on. As such, I would advise caution when overexerting this quirk to avoid incidents such as the quirk activating without prompting, the quirk being impossible to turn off, the quirk refusing to obey the user's will, or, at worst, the quirk causing grievous injuries to the user. Sir Night Eye flipped the printed document close, returning to its presentation page. Just like the analysis it contained, the front page had a very professional look to it. The faintest hint of a smile graced his features. The commission could complain all they wanted about the young analysis being an unknown variable, being a risk to their organization and whatnot. The fact remained, that boy sure as hell was talented. Silly traditions, Izuku decided, were a must. He never really had a chance to create any before joining the police force, but now, he was quite glad that the age gap between him and his colleagues didn't stop it from happening. He ate lunch with Sakai and Honda daily, talked about that one series with Sans on breaks, and, his favorite, went out for coffee with Tsukachi at least once a week. Tsukachi had actually been the one to first introduce him to the wonders of Lascale by vaguely mentioning the existence of the small cafe in passing, unknowingly feeding into the teen's caffeine addiction. And while he was aware of the problem his caffeine consumption represented, it took a while longer for the detective to realize that, just like he was, the kid also visited the cafe on a regular basis. After that, it became more and more likely to see the two of them leave the precinct together to go fetch something to give them the energy to go through their days. It also, consequently, became more likely for them to go out of their way to visit the cafe rather than complete their most tedious tasks. So far Tsuragami had not caught on yet, allowing them to get away with it. Or so they thought. The chief was more aware of what went down in his precinct than what they gave him credit for and relented where he had to. He had quickly accepted their regular disappearances as a consequence of their good work. And Kami forbids he took away Midoriya's drive to actually take breaks rather than work himself into the ground. So, once more, thinking that they were discreet, they snuck away toward a warm cup of liquid energy, walking the short distance to Renard's establishment, making a quick run of it this time around. With their schedule varying so much, Izuku's especially, they couldn't always take their time, and today, like so many other days before, the teen had an analysis to turn in before the deadline his client gave him. Thankfully, as stated previously, the cafe was not far from the police station, and the walk to and from typically never took long. Typically. Did you hear that? Tsukachi asked. Explosions resonated in the distance, making them pause. The sound was faint at first, but each one grew louder and louder. Maybe it's a hero fight? Izuku made a guess. And it could very well be, but a few factors made him queasy. Like the absence of heroes with a quirk that could have such applications in the area. One of the upsides of working for the police force was the information that came with it, and one of the most relevant pieces of knowledge that came with it, both for Izuku's job and his hobby, was the large board letting the officers know which heroes were in the area, may they be on or off duty. Izuku always checked which name appeared on that list, every day without a fault. And he always knew what those heroes were capable of thanks to years of research. That's how he knew that no hero was causing this ruckus. That's also how he knew that no hero in the immediate area was equipped to deal with an active bomber. Another explosion resonated, this time shaking the buildings. Tsukachi stumbled, cursing at the obvious lack of control over the situation. A potted plant fell down from a windowsill, shattering on the sidewalk below, splashing dirt all over Izuku's shiny shoes. The piercing sound of car alarms filled his ears in the very next moment. Without thinking about it twice, he took off running in the direction of the explosions. He wasn't sure what he would do once on the scene, but he had to be able to at least think of a possible solution. It was what he was paid to do, so it had to mean something. Izuku vaguely heard Tsukachi curse, again, and call out his name, but paid him no mind, keeping his eyes on the sidewalk in front of him to ensure that he did not run into a poor civilian. While there are still chances of it being good old explosives, people nowadays depend too much on their quirks to go out of their way to get their ends on the materials needed to make a bomb. There have also been too many explosions in a row for it to realistically be a bombing. Had that been the case, the bomber would have been more likely to make the decision of exploding all of his ammunition at once to avoid them being disabled. It could also be a variety of different types of quirks. Something real, like Bakugo's, which would, quite honestly, be a worst-case scenario, the property damage involved would only have more risks to the pre-existing situation. Something purely cosmetic, that simulates an explosion without causing the typical physical damage, which, if used properly, could fool even a seasoned pro into thinking it real, or something purely sound-based, which would only, like the previous possibility, cause panic among the crowd. Best-case scenario, and Izuku should be able to tell through either the absence of anything indicating a physical explosion like bright lights and smoke, or through the culprit's behavior, the villain could simply be tackled to the ground and neutralized. Depending on their size, he might need to pass along that information to a hero rather than rush in himself. Worst-case scenario. Well, Backdraft was said to be in the area, and should he not be available, commercial and residential buildings still are required to have fire extinguishers. Otherwise, they would have to hope for the best and wait for reinforcements. Izuku's mind was still going through all the possibilities when he reached the crowd that had gathered to witness the fight, and for the first time in his life, he cursed the fascination civilians seemed to have for hero fights. He was short and frail. How on earth was he meant to go through the mass without being crushed? Cursing under his breath, his day was going very poorly, he can be excused for his language. He pushed through, doing his best to reach the front of the crowd. He needed to see. He needed to confirm. He needed to devise a plan. And of course, curse him and whatever higher power set up this whole situation, but none of his previous theories. His breath caught in his throat, caught off guard by both the impossible situation he found himself in and recognizing the source of the explosions. Of course Bakugo had to be the cause of the ruckus. And of course it wasn't even his fault. He cursed under his breath, not quite sure of how to deal with a villain with a sludge-like quirk holding hostage a civilian with an explosion quirk, and all the property damage that caused. Izuku walked as close as he could to the scene, trying to get a better ensemble view of the whole thing. He held tightly onto the security cord as he searched this hellscape of a fight for a weakness to exploit. There had to be one. There doesn't appear to be anything corporeal to the villain, meaning that Bakugo has little to no other option than to try and swim out of his attacker's grasp. Whatever the villain is made out of, which is clearly not water-based, otherwise the close proximity to the explosion would have caused the villain to, at the very least, partly evaporate by now. It's not solid enough for him to get a hold of it, but thick enough to hold him back, making it even more tricky to get out of. Bakugo's panic is also not helping anyone. The heat of the explosions, as well as the raw danger they represent, is keeping any hero on sight at bay. He's also not in a mental state suited to listen to what anyone might have to tell him, and even if he was, he's far too close to the villain to get him involved in any kind of plan to free him. So, Bakugo's cooperation clearly is not something we can count on in this situation. There had to be something else. The eyes. They just bumped against Bakugo's head. I clearly saw them, meaning that they must be solid. Izuku squinted at the villain's face, paying special attention to where his eyes were if only to confirm his theory. If he had seen right, then he might just have found the solution to the current dilemma. And sure enough, the eyes bumped against Bakugo's head once more, rippling oddly in his gelatinous body. The eyes are the weakness then. That's easily exploitable, especially with Kamui Woods on the scene. With Arbor, the hero could easily reach for the eyes while staying far enough to not be harmed by the explosions or grabbed by the villain. Sure, there was the risk of burning off the branches by bringing them too close to a still panicky Bakugo, but it might just be worth it if it can 1. Free the civilian and 2. Distract the villain long enough to neutralize him. Now with a somewhat solid plan in mind, and not much time left to act if the importance of the fire damage was as bad as it looked to be, Izuku slipped under the security cord and ran over to Kamui Woods. Thankfully, he was both the hero nearest to him and the central piece to his plan. Pro-hero Kamui Woods, he called out to grab his attention. Tsukachi swore under his breath, cursing both his poor cardio and the hyperactive kid he made himself to be responsible for. He wasn't even sure why he was surprised that Midoriya took off toward the danger like he did just now. The kid did always have a knack for stupidly impulsive decisions, and nowadays Tsukachi had to pay the price for it by making sure the kid did not throw himself into oncoming traffic. That would certainly be awkward to explain to his mother. He took off after the kid, already knowing that he wouldn't be able to catch up to him and settling for the second best thing. If he can't stop Midoriya from putting himself in danger, he can at least do damage control after the fact. Maybe he'd manage to convince whatever villain was causing this ruckus to spare the kid. Unlikely, but a man can dream. His first look at the situation was the crowd that started drifting away from the scene, blocking the way and slowing him down. None of them appeared to be scared in any way though, so Tsukachi assumed it must have ended well. One less thing to worry about. The next thing he knew was that there was yelling. Not panicked screams, nor war cries. It sounded like people were arguing. Quite loudly at that. He paused. Whatever it was for, it came from the same direction the civilians were coming from, and so the same direction Midoriya had run in. So even if it was nothing worth his attention, he still needed to go that way. But knowing the rivalry that existed within the hero community and the arrival of the newly licensed Mount Lady, there might have been some kind of disagreement on how to go about that fight. If so, Tsukachi might have to get involved before it gets bad enough to become a problem for the police force. After all, a shitty work environment was an especially bad idea when it comes to law enforcement. They only needed one argument to break in the middle of a critical situation for it to all go to hell. Tsukachi took back off jogging toward the source of the raised voice. Hopefully, nothing was said just yet that wasn't fixable. Maybe Izuku was already there, trying to fix whatever it was. But of course, he had no such luck. Right there, only 15 meters beyond the security tape, was none other than Midoriya Izuku himself, arguing with pro-hero Kamui Woods. And it was an animated fight at that, with the kid agitatedly explaining whatever he was explaining to the exasperated hero. And Tsukachi might want to get involved before any of the heroes that stayed behind after the action does something that they will regret. Quickly flashing his badge at the officers patrolling the security perimeter, Tsukachi made his way to the still arguing duo, once again flashing his badge, this time to the hero, before turning to the young analyst. Would you mind telling me what's going on here? Tsukachi dash. Detective, I'm glad you're here. This child here disturbed an ongoing fight and put everyone involved in dash. Did I ask you? Tsukachi interrupted Kamui Woods, his voice still pleasant, but his eyes asked the man to wait for his turn. What seems to be the problem, Midoriya? Well, you see Tsukachi, there was this fight going on, again a villain with a sludge-based quirk, allowing the subject to turn their physical body into some kind of watery slime, with all the properties you would expect from a similar material from artificial origins. And obviously, the heroes were having a hard time neutralizing a villain that can literally slip through their fingers. Which is all right, of course. I wouldn't expect any hero to be perfectly suited to deal with every kind of quirk that exists. But in this case, the subject had a hostage, so I concluded that we needed to act fast. So I identified one of the villain's weaknesses and went to tell Kamui Woods to go for the eyes. Tsukachi waited for the kid to continue, but when he instead kept his silence, he prompted more information out of him. And then, what do you mean dash? Kamui Woods started, but Tsukachi interrupted him by raising a finger, indicating him to keep quiet. Midoriya shrugged. And then they wouldn't listen to me. But there isn't really an issue seeing that All Might came in soon after and stopped the villain himself. Tsukachi sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose between his index and his thumb, already feeling tired from the whole incident. This was like introducing the kid to the precinct all over again. Cammy, they had been supposed to go out for coffee, not this, whatever it is. And why, Kamui Woods, did you not at least hear him out? Are you kidding me? He's a child, what does he know? Seemingly more than you, since he managed to identify the weaknesses of a villain you had been struggling with. But he's just a kid. I'm a pro-hero. What makes him, a literal child, more knowledgeable than I am on how to exploit a villain's weaknesses? Tsukachi sighed again. Kid, would you just show him your ID so we can move on and go back to the precinct? Oh, right. He scrambled to get the incriminating piece of plastic out of his wallet, struggling to find the aforementioned object in his bag, but eventually ending it to the hero. Here. Kamui Woods took the card, read the name printed on it, and paused. He then looked up at the bushy-haired teenager in front of him, then back down at the card, and back to Midoriya. After some more consideration, he finally spoke up. "You're the analyst Hawks worked with?" If his voice sounded small and nerves-ridden, neither Tsukachi nor Midoriya said a word about it.